Saint Beuve possessed all the qualifications required of the historian of Jansenism. He was not a believer, but he had been, or believed that he had been one. A man is seldom capable of criticizing the views he holds himself, and as seldom of understanding those which he has never held. What we all understand best are the views we once shared, but share no longer. If anyone doubts Saint Beuve's ability to understand these medieval emotions, that impulse to forsake the world, that strife of the awakened soul with nature, and its repentant, anxious recourse to grace. If anyone doubts his comprehension of the real spirit inspiring these sermons and theological pamphlets, of the hearts, beating under these nuns' habits, of the devotion, the hopes, and the longings, the mystical ecstasies and the sacred enthusiasm, which flourished on that little spot of holy ground, let that doubter read the first two volumes of Port Royal, as far as the chapter on Pascal, who was easier of comprehension because he was a figure of more magnitude and was already better known. Let him study the masterly portraits of Saint Francois de Sales and Saint Cyran and observe how, with the help of letters, reported conversations, and a few pamphlets and sermons, Saint Beuve succeeds in placing before us two figures which are so true to nature, so human, that we seem to be living with them. We are frequently reminded of the fact that Saint Beuve was originally a novelist. The scenes among the innocent dwellers in that dovecote, the convent, for instance, have all the vividness of well-written fiction. And Saint Beuve employs his imagination only in describing. He never invents or misrepresents. It is a defect in the book that its first parts, though they are much the best reading, are not conceived in the historical style. We are too vividly reminded that the feuilleton has hitherto been their author's vehicle of expression. In these earlier volumes, Saint Beuve simply takes Port Royal as his starting point. The old monastery is not much more than his citadel, from which he makes one sortie after another. He hunts out parallels, discovers analogies, now in literature, now in real life interesting, but often far-fetched, and leading to disquisitions not only upon such writers as Corneille, Racine, Molière, Voltaire, and Vauvenargues, but upon modern authors, such as Lamartine and George Sand. The later volumes, on the other hand, the style of which is more soberly historical, lack the attraction of these interpolations, and the subject is too much of a special subject to interest long, in spite of the loving care which has been bestowed on it. Though Port Royal is supposed to be his chief work, Saint Beuve reaches a far higher level in the long series of volumes known as Causeries du Lundi and Nouveaux Lundis, which contain the shorter articles written during his most perfect period. It will be long before these articles are forgotten. At the time of their author's death, Ulbach wrote, "I cannot tell how much of the literature of which we are now so proud will be preserved by time. Some of Lamartine's and Victor Hugo's verses, some of Balzac's novels. One thing, however, is certain that it will be impossible to write history without having recourse to Saint Beuve and reading him from beginning to end." Saint Beuve has two styles, the youthful and the mature. At the time of his study of 16th century literature, from the vocabulary of which he, like the other young romanticists, adopted various expressions, he got into the habit of picking and choosing his words and polishing and refining his periods to such an extent that he drew down upon himself some justifiably severe criticism, though he hardly deserved the violent reproaches showered on him by Balzac, whom he had annoyed by some sarcastic articles. But when he took to journalism, this ultra-refinement of style disappeared. As Litter remarked, after he had bound himself to send in a feuilleton every week, he had no time to spoil his articles. A style like Saint Beuve's second, keen and flexible as a sword blade, is not easy to characterize. In the first place, it is by no means a striking style. The reader who is not particularly well versed in French literature will not be aware of anything that can be called style. The periods succeed one another unrhythmically. They are not grouped but proceed carelessly, as zouaves march. We never come upon a pompous and seldom on a passionate one. Occasionally there is an interjectio poet, or the like. The language flows like gently rippling water, but the observant reader is charmed by its noble atticism. The tone is not assertive but calmly and quietly skeptic. I give a few examples, taken from different works. Is there stability or instability at the basis of his character? You think instability. But under that instability, is there not something more stable? You believe that there is. But under this again, is there not something less stable than ever? How often in their study of character must psychologists query thus, but how few of them could put the question with such delicate precision? What has been called the eccentricity of Saint Beuve's style is often only something surprising in his imagery. Yet the metaphor itself is always surprisingly correct. In describing a great, austere 16th century preacher of repentance, He tells that this ecclesiastic's contemporaries compared him, because of his dry severity, to a thorn bush. Later, after giving an account of a vigorous outburst of noble indignation on the part of this man, he adds, CJI pu dire de 1000. De Saint Cyrin quil edate parfois unbuisen, et unbuisen sans jamais de rires, il faut adjuter quil est souvent aussi unbuisen ardent. Observe how the pliant style lends itself to irony and satire. Saint Beuve is criticizing the style of a literary rival, Nissard. Amongst much bittersweet praise, he insinuates the little remark, un academicien lui trouve du nerf, les savants lui trouvent de la grace. Of Cousin he says, he is a hare with the eye of an eagle. For an example of the power of characterization latent in the style, take the following sentence from a criticism of de Musset. Si enedet pas des couleurs combines, surdoutis par un précide successif, mais bien le real si, dorant qu'et la commun. Adam a un rayon du matin, et essenvalent tout d'un coup au regard dans une transfiguration divinici. And for an example of its capacity, equable as it is to express indignation, take the following passage, which also throws light on the character of the man. He is writing on the subject of a work to which the Academy in full conclave had refused to give the prize adjudged it by a committee of experts, because the atheistical principles on which the work was based were at variance with the eclectic philosophy then officially recognized. There really does exist a small class of sober, unassuming philosophers who live upon very little, do not intrigue, and are entirely occupied in conscientiously seeking after truth and cultivating their intellects. They refrain from the indulgence of every other passion, and fix their whole attention upon the laws which govern the universe, listening and investigating wherever in the realm of nature the world thought reveals itself to them. These are men who at heart are Stoics, who try to do good and to think as accurately and rightly as they can, even without the hope of any personal reward in the future, content to feel at harmony with themselves, and in accord with the harmony of the universe. Is it fitting, I ask, to stamp these men with an odious name on this account, to ostracize them, or at best only to tolerate them with such tolerance as we show to the erring and guilty? Have they not even yet won for themselves in our country a place on which the sunlight falls? Have they not, O ye noble eclectics, with whom it gives me pleasure to compare them, ye whose invariable and absolute disinterestedness, and whose unalterable high-mindedness are known to God and man, have they not the right to be placed at least on an equal footing with you, in virtue of the purity of their doctrine, the uprightness of their motives, and the innocence of their lives? This last great progressive step, worthy of the 19th century, I would fain see taken before I die. Saint Beuve made various reforms in the art of criticism. In the first place, he put solid ground beneath its feet, gave it the firm foothold of history and science. The old, so-called philosophically criticism treated the literary document as if it had fallen from the clouds, judged it without taking its author into account at all, and placed it under some particular heading in a historical or aesthetic chart. Saint Beuve found the author in his work. Behind the paper he discovered the man. He taught his own generation, and the generations to come, that no book, no document of the past, can be understood before we have gained an understanding of the psychical conditions which produced it, and formed an idea of the personality of the man who wrote it. Not until then does the document live. Not until then does a soul animate history. Not until then does the work of art become transparently intelligible. Saint Beuve's most marked characteristic was an insatiable thirst for knowledge, a quality which he possessed in the form that may be called scientific inquisitiveness. This directed his life even before it expressed itself in his criticism. At first it is only faintly perceptible in his works, because he began with unlimited praise of his contemporaries, Chateaubriand, Lamartine, Victor Hugo, Alfred de Vigny, and others, a good deal of which he was obliged subsequently to retract, this progressing in the opposite direction from Théophile Gautier, who began with severity and gradually declined into a nerveless leniency. But it is possible to trace even Saint Beuve's first uncritical praise to his critical instincts. Its exaggeratedness was due to the fact that he stood, as a young man, too near to the personages he criticized, but this circumstance was itself attributable to his curiosity. Before he knew, he dimly divined the difference between books and life, and was less apt than others to accept the author's own account of himself, the image of himself which he desired, by means of his book, to imprint on his readers' minds. And it was the unconscious instinct of investigation, the keen interest of the born psychologist, the longing to see for himself and close at hand, the inclination to pass by all that was official and conventional, and make straight for the truth that is concealed, the small facts which explained that led him to seek personal acquaintance. Though he himself believed that it was his enthusiasm for ideas which attracted him irresistibly to their originators. And here the critic is confronted by one of his greatest difficulties, knows the truth only about the living, but may speak it only of the dead. And there is no doubt that it makes a disagreeable impression when the death of an author entirely changes the tone of criticism, as Saint Beuve's criticism of Chateaubriand, for example, was altered by the latter's death. His earliest article on Chateaubriand was Incense Pure and Simple. We are conscious of the social pressure under which it was written, of the awe and veneration, the personal sympathies and relations, the fear of angry glances from lovely eyes, the impossibility of hurting the feelings of so charming a lady as Madame Récamier by criticizing her domestic idol, in short, of all the influences which combined to make the first sketch of Chateaubriand simply an adulatory narrative. The long work and the later articles are, on the contrary, inspired by a perfect rage for saying no, for tearing off masks. But when he is at his best, Saint Beuve succeeds in finding the golden mean. He does not admire everything and attribute everything to noble motives, but neither does he search for base ones. He neither praises nor depreciates human nature. He understands it. And intercourse with men and women of every description, constant critical observation, French delicacy of perception, and a Parisian training have given him an extraordinary power of discernment. At his best, the manicidedness of his mind actually reminds us of Goethe. We are at times tempted to call him wise, and few indeed are the critics who tempt us to apply this adjective to them. He very seldom allows himself to be confused or influenced by the popular sentiment connected with a name, no matter whether it is lofty or pathetic or depreciatory. He inquires into the pedigree of his author, his constitution and health, his economic position. He snaps up some involuntary confession he has made, and shows that it is supported by other utterances, and that it throws light on and explains the actions of the man. He describes him in his bright and noble moments. He surprises him in déshabille. With his marvelous capacity for finding a needle in a haystack, he discovers what the dead man concealed in the inmost recesses of his heart. With the judicial calm of the scientific investigator, he enumerates his tendencies towards good and his tendencies towards evil, and weighs them in the balance. And by such means he produces a trustworthy portrait, or rather, a series of portraits, each one of which is trustworthy, though some of them contradict each other. For, notable critic as Saint Beuve is, he invariably shirks one of the greatest difficulties with which the critic has to contend. A conscientious critic has, as a rule, read the work which he undertakes to interpret and criticize, many times and at various stages of his development. Each time he has been struck by something different, and in the end he has seen the work from so many different points of view that it is impossible for him, without doing a sort of inward violence to himself, to maintain one single standpoint, one attitude of feeling. And if he happens to be dealing, not with a single work, but with a highly productive author who has passed through many stages of development, or possibly even with a whole school of literature, the difficulty of making one comprehensive picture out of the many different impressions received under totally different psychical conditions becomes proportionately greater. A building which we have seen only once, half of it in sunlight, half in the shadow of a heavy cloud, stands out distinctly in our memory in a certain light against a particular sky. But a building we have seen at every hour of day, in the dusk and in moonlight, from all sides, from various elevations, and as often from the inside as the outside, a building in which we have lived, and the size of which has dwindled in our eyes as we grew off such a building, we find it difficult to give a single, fully descriptive picture. This difficulty Saint Beuve avoids by constantly producing fresh descriptions and fresh criticisms of the same men and their works, leaving it to the reader to draw his own conclusions. It was with good reason that he chose as the motto for a series of his works the saying of Sénèque de Mailhen, Nous sommes mobiles et nous jugens d'être mobiles. The latter of these propositions, namely, that every human being whom we judge has altered, has developed steadily, Saint Beuve understood better than it had ever been understood before. He not only changes his tone every time he changes his theme, but changes it every time there is a change in the man or woman who is his theme for the time being. His agile talent imitates all the movements of the individual human soul during its development process. Hence his manner is as changeable as his subject. He is now the biographer, now the critic. He packs as many limiting and defining parentheses into his periods as possible, connects sentences which modify one another, uses technical words which introduce a whole train of ideas and memories, and vague expressions which may mean much more than they say. For though he moves through the dim depths of a man's life with the certainty of the diver who sees the submarine growths through the water, He nevertheless, for many reasons, prefers to write with a certain amount of vagueness of what he has seen. When he is writing of the living, it is, of course, only permissible to make vague allusions to their private life. And the dead have, as a rule, descendants or relatives who keep jealous guard over their reputation. Saint Beuve, therefore, generally contents himself with showing that he divines or knows much on which he does not choose to dwell. With the course of years, he became bolder and more scientific in his psychological analysis. In the following passage, he defends his right to be so. It is taken from a letter written on the 9th of May 1863 to a critic who had blamed him for certain disparaging remarks in one of his articles. Art, and especially a purely intellectual art like that of criticism, is an instrument which is difficult to handle, and its worth is dependent upon the worth of the artist. Granted this, is it not absolutely necessary to have done with that foolish conventionality, that cant, which compels us to judge an author not only by his intentions, but also by his pretensions? Am I, for example, to be obliged to see in Fontaine's only the great master, polished, noble, elegant, religious, and not the hasty, brusque, sensual man that he really was? Or to come to our own day, I have had the opportunity for 30 years and more of observing Villemain, a man of distinguished intellect and talent, who is actually brimming over with generous, liberal, philanthropic, Christian, civilizing sentiment, but who is, nevertheless, the most sordid, malicious ape in existence. What is to be done in such a case? Are we to go on to all eternity praising his noble, elevated sentiments, as those by whom he is surrounded do? Are we to dupe ourselves and dupe others? Are men of letters, historians, and moralists merely actors, whom we have no right to study, except in the roles which they have chosen and defined for themselves? Are we only permitted to see them on the stage? Or is it allowable, when our knowledge is sufficient, boldly and yet gently to insert the scalpel and show the weak points of the armor, the faulty joints between the talent and the soul? Allowable to praise the talent whilst indicating the defects in the soul which actually affect the talent and any permanent influence it may exercise. Will literature lose by such a proceeding? It is possible that it may, but the science of psychology will gain. This, then, is the first advance of firm ground beneath our feet. No deceptive idealization. The next is that criticism, which had hitherto been a disintegrating, separating process, becomes in Saint Beuve's hands, and with the limitations entailed by his character, an organizing, constructive process. His criticism produces an organism, a life, as poetry does. It does not break up the given material into road metal and gravel, but erects a building with it. It does not break up the human soul into its component parts, so that we only gain an understanding of it as a piece of dead mechanism, without having any idea what it is like when it is in movement. No, he shows us the machine at work. We see the fire that drives it and hear the noise it makes, whilst we are learning the secrets of its construction. Thanks to these reforms of Saint Beuve's, the history of literature, which used to be a kind of secondary, inferior branch of the science of history, has become the guide of history proper, its most interesting and most living part. For the literature of nations is the most attractive and most instructive material with which history has to deal. We began by asserting that Saint Beuve's critical activity did not lead him to forsake poetry. We are now in a position to prove that the art of the critic, as practiced by him in the last years of his life, in the highest stage of his development, had entered into the closest relationship with modern poetry. For poetry became synthetic simultaneously with criticism, and the cause of the movement was the same in both cases, namely, the gradual conquest by science of the whole domain of modern intellectual life. At the beginning of the century, imagination was considered the essential quality in poetry. It was his capacity of invention which made the poet a poet. He was not tied down to nature and reality, but was as much at home in the supernatural as in the actual world. In the generation of 1830, such authors as Nodier and Alexander Dumas expressed this view of the matter, each in his own way. But as Romanticism by degrees developed into realism, creative literature by degrees gave up its fantastic excursions into space. It exerted itself even more to understand than to invent, and this produced a close connection with criticism. Fiction became psychological. The point of departure of the novelist and of the critic in their respective descriptions is now the same, namely, the spiritual atmosphere of a period. In it, the real or invented characters appear to us. The novelist's aim is to represent and interpret the actions of a human being, the critic's, to represent and interpret a work, in such a manner that the reader may see both the actions and the work to be results produced with real or apparent inevitability, when certain inward qualities or tendencies are acted upon by suggestions from without. The only fundamental difference is that the creative author makes the speech and the actions of his characters, who, fictitious though they are generally drawn from life, the probable consequences of given circumstances, whereas the critic's imagination, fettered by facts, necessarily restricts itself to the representation of the psychical condition which led to or influenced the utterances and actions he describes. The novelist deduces a man's probable actions from what he has observed of his character. The critic deduces a man's character from his works. Criticism, understood as the capacity of overcoming one's natural narrow-mindedness by the wideness and many-sidedness of one's sympathies, has been a distinguishing faculty of all the greatest authors of this century. It was from this point of view that Émile Montaigut regarded it when he called it the youngest genius, the Cinderella among the intelligences. Criticism, he wrote, is the 10th muse. It was she who was Goethe's mystic bride. It was she who made 20 poets of him. What but criticism is the basis of German literature? What are the English poets of our own day? Inspired critics. What was Italy's noble Leopardi? A fiery critic. Amongst all the modern poets, only two, Byron and Lamartine, have not been critics, and for this reason these two have lacked many-sidedness and variety and have become as monotonous as they are. When criticism is taken in a wider sense, in the full meaning of the word, this last limitation falls away. For in its signification of the power of passing judgment on the existing state of things, it was an inspiring force in all the great romantic lyric writers of the period, Byron as well as Hugo, Lamartine as well as George Sand. From the moment when their poetry ceases to exclude all important contemporary life and thought, from the moment when the romantic lyric poets transform themselves into the organs of great ideas, criticism becomes an inspiring principle in their works also. It inspired Hugo's Les Châtiments. It inspired Byron's Don Juan. It is a fingerpost on the path of the human mind. It plants hedges and lights torches along that path. It cuts and clears new tracks. For it is criticism which removes mountains of belief in authority, of prejudice, of idealist power and dead tradition. Roman 32. The drama, Vitet Dumas de Vigny Hugo. The success of the Romantic school in lyric poetry, fiction, and criticism was indisputable. But there was one branch of literature in which it failed to realize the bold expectations with which it started on its career. And this was the branch which, according to the old principles of aesthetics, was, and curiously enough, as a rule, still is regarded as the highest, namely, the drama. As the art stood in such high estimation, the comparative slightness of their success in it was painfully felt by the Romanticists. Their plays never found real favor with the public, never became part of the permanent repertory of any theater. Victor Hugo's were only popular as librettos for Italian operas. Mérimé's were never played at all. George Sand's and Balzac's had generally only a succès d'estime, and it was long before a few of Alfred de Musset's short pieces found their way onto the stage. Whereas Scribe and his collaborators drew full houses, not only in France but abroad. And yet the school did much admirable work in the domain of drama. The first essay was made by Vitet, who between 1826 and 1829 wrote a succession of scènes dramatiques, subsequently published in a collected form under the title of La Ligue. The original idea had suggested itself to him of dramatizing episodes in French history without adding anything fictitious whatever. His imagination was allowed to do nothing but vitalize history, and it succeeded most admirably in doing so. The atmosphere of Vitet's works is the atmosphere of long-past days, and the talk of his 16th century characters conveys such an impression of authenticity that we feel when we are reading his dramas as if we were living history, hour by hour. Ludovic Vitet was born in Paris in 1802, received his education at the École Normale, took part as a liberal in the political movements of the day, was a member of the Société Étoile Ciel Théâtre, and wrote, as already mentioned in the Globe, as an ardent champion of Romanticism. His poetico-historical works were all produced in this youthful period, with the exception of a series of dramatic scenes, distinctly inferior to the rest, which he published in 1849 under the title of Les Edis d'Orléans. His career was uneventful. As a young man, he was an inseparable friend of Count Duchtel. When the Revolution of July placed his friends in power, and Duchtel became a member of the Guizot ministry, Vitet was made inspector of historical monuments, a post which Guizot devised specially for him. Henceforth, he was a politician. In 1834, he became a member of the Chamber of Deputies. In 1836, a member of the Council of State. In 1846, a member of the Academy. He was a consistent monarchist and conservative. From 1851 to 1871, he held aloof from public affairs altogether. After the war, he again took a prominent position under Thiers. He died in 1873. Vitet furnishes a good example of the power of the first impetus of a strong artistic movement to inspire even minds which are not productive and artistic by nature. After 1830, he was eminent only as a learned historian of art. He wrote a biography of Count Duchtel. His literary and historical essays are as dry and tedious as Maramis. To his youthful works we always return with pleasure. Rideau Les Barricades, Les Etats de Blois, and La Mort de Henry III. The principal characters in them, Henry Roman II, Henry III, and the Dukes of Guise of several successive generations, are portrayed in such masterly style as to bear comparison with the heroes of Shakespeare's great historical plays Henry IV and Richard III, certainly accepted. The manners and ideas of the age are so clearly placed before us that we feel as if they cannot have been better known or understood by contemporaries. Les Etats de Blois is unmistakably the finest of these works. Let anyone who wishes to make acquaintance with Vitet at his best read the scenes which describe the murder of the Duke of Guise. Seldom has an author ventured to set aside poetic convention to such an extent in a historical play. The event is much more vividly and realistically brought before us than even in Delaroche's fine painting, which shows us Henry III cautiously opening the door and peeping at the body of his great enemy lying on the floor. Vitet first shows us the king in his room at 4 o'clock in the morning, dipping Spanish poniards into holy water and tremblingly handing them to his minions without even daring to utter his enemy's name. Then comes the scene in the duke's room, in which his mother and his mistress in vain beseech him not to imperil his life, but to keep away from the council to be held next morning. We next see him in the council chamber. An uncomfortable feeling comes over him. His nose begins to bleed. He has forgotten his handkerchief and sends a messenger to fetch it. The Scottish guards stupidly bar this messenger's way, but they quickly perceive their mistake, and the Duke gets the handkerchief. But he is uneasy, this great soldier who has faced drawn blades so often without turning pale, and he begins to feel faint. It is because he is still fasting. The feeling will pass off if he eats something. He opens the little bonbonniere which hangs at his belt. It is empty. Someone is dispatched to fetch him sweetmeats or fruit. At this moment Rival comes out of the king's apartment and says, "The king wishes to speak with you, Monseigneur." The other lords of the council stop their conversation and exchange glances. The duke rises. He takes a little time to fasten his mantle, which slips first off one shoulder, then off the other. He is unconsciously trying to delay his departure at proud not to be ready to go, even if it be to death, and yet human enough to hesitate a moment on the fatal threshold. He must have another handkerchief, as the first is stained with blood. Again, one of the conspirators goes, leaving the others in anxious suspense. It is a masterly representation, this of Vitet's, of the restlessness, impatience, and foolish feeling of shame which at times overcome us and impel us to rush blindly into the most hazardous situations, merely to escape from painfully ridiculous ones. The messenger sent for the handkerchief again delays. Then the proud Guise loses patience. With the words, "I cannot keep the king waiting longer," he goes out at the door. As it closes behind him, a dozen officers thrust their long poniards into his body. We observe that Vitet enters into details which would be unsuitable for the stage. His scenes dramatiques are only intended to be read, therefore they are not genuine dramas. And the explanation of this is that Vitet, with all his historical insight, lacked both poetic passion and the artistic gift of organization. Because he is never capable of developing pathos, of rising to a climax, from the height of which all the rest would be felt to be preparation and result, he never attains to really artistic construction. He was evidently haunted by a species of artistic anxiety, a fear of making the slightest alteration in the historical facts, a fear of obtruding his own personality. He had not a strong enough individuality to dare to issue an artistic coinage stamped with his own image. His productivity ceased as early as it did, because the imagination which inspired his works, though vigorous, was not free, not independent, either in its observation or in its reproduction. It was hampered and weighted by scholarship, by the dust of the record office. This beautiful and fiery Pegasus stood tethered in a library. It would be a shame to employ the same metaphor in writing of the romantic author who, following in Vitet's steps, set himself to dramatize historical episodes, and who in February 1829, a year before Victor Hugo, achieved popularity with a historical drama, Henry III. Et Sacre. This writer was Alexander Dumas, born in 1803, a man of brilliant, spontaneous talent and titanic constitution, who displayed the same aptitude for Herculean tasks in literature as his father had done in war. For 40 years, he continued without a pause to produce tragedies, comedies, novels, short stories, books of travel, and memoirs. It would be foolish to write contemptuously of such prodigious inventiveness, such incredible productivity. We can trace in these works the French-African blood. There is something in them of the easygoing Creole disposition, something of the ardent sensuality of the Negro race. Assisted by numerous collaborators, all much inferior to himself, Dumas peopled the stages, crowded the booksellers' shelves, filled the feuilleton columns of the newspapers with the creations of his brain. The printing presses creaked and groaned in their efforts to keep pace with his incessant production. What one cannot but regret is the easygoing worldliness which prevented any real process of development taking place. Dumas was an artist only in his first period. Beginning in a romantic age, he began romantically. Continuing in a commercial age, he continued commercially. In Henry Roman III, Et sa cœur, he did what Vatet had not succeeded in doing with the same historical material, namely, produced a spirited and playable drama. But it was a drama in which the defiance of classic theatrical convention was of the most superficial kind. He ventured to reproduce in externals the court customs of the period. On the boards where for a couple of centuries the hero and his confidant had conversed either with both arms hanging by their sides or with their left hands on their sword hilts, a whole troop of King Henry's courtiers appeared with cups and balls. The game of Cupid ball was an invention of that day. And in the pauses, these same gentlemen amused themselves by blowing small darts out of blowpipes. Nevertheless, they felt and spoke like the young men of 1828. The psychology of the other historical plays of Dumas' youth Napoleon Bonaparte, Charles Roman 7 Chez ses Grands Vassox, 100, is equally superficial. It was not until he lit upon an age the spirit of which he understood and could master, that he succeeded in giving such excellent representations of past days as we have in the interesting and effective dramas. Unmarriage sous Louis Roman 15 and Gabrielle de Belle-Isle, both of which, and especially the latter, with its slightly idealized picture of the manners and customs of the Regency, possess real literary value. But before this, in 1831, it had fallen to Dumas' lot to present the young Romantic generation with one of the typical figures which it recognized as representative of itself. He wrote Antony. With all its faults, there is something in this play which makes it better than even the best of Dumas' other works. There is warmer blood, more human nature in it than in the others. And the reason why, with all its naivete, it makes a really powerful impression on us is that in it Dumas has flung his own ego, himself, with his wild passion, his youthful enthusiasm, and chivalrous instincts, onto the stage. Antony is an 1830 hero, of the same type as all of Hugues broad-shouldered, lion-maned, enthusiastic and despairing, capable of living without food or sleep, ready at any moment to blow out his own or anyone else's brains. But the sensation produced by Antony was due to the fact that Dumas had done what Hugo never would or could do, namely, laid the action of his play in 1830, and put his hero on the stage dressed in the fashion of the day, in the very same black coat as the male members of the audience wore. Hitherto, Romanticism had voluntarily restricted itself on the stage to the Middle Ages. Now it revealed itself in undisguised modernity. We come upon a vindication of this step in the play itself. A conversation on the subject of the literary disputes of the day is introduced into the fourth act. During the course of it, a poet, who is defending the Romanticists' practice of going back to the Middle Ages for their themes, says, "The drama of passion must necessarily be historical drama. History bequeaths to us the passionate deeds which were really done. If in the midst of our modern society we were to attempt to lay bare the heart which beats under our ugly short black coats, the resemblance between the hero and the public would be too great. The spectator, who was following the development of a passion, would desire to have it arrested exactly where it would have stopped in his own case. He would cry, 'Stop! That is wrong. That is not how I feel. When the woman whom I love deceives me, I suffer, certainly, but I neither kill her nor myself.' And the outcry against exaggeration and melodrama would drown the applause of the few who feel that the passions of the 19th century are the same as those of the 16th, and that the blood can course as hotly beneath a cloth coat as beneath a steel corselet." We can imagine the applause which followed this speech. All wished to show that they belonged to these few. Passion was the order of the day, and they proved themselves to be passionate by applauding. And Antony truly is a symphony of raging passions, the like of which it would be difficult to find. After several years of travel, the hero returns to Paris and finds that the woman he loves is married. He saves her life at the risk of his own by stopping her runaway horses. The shaft of the carriage has pierced his breast. He is carried into her house. Antony is an illegitimate child and a foundling. Hence, as a lover, he is a rebel against the laws of society. Other men, he says to the woman he loves, have a father, a mother, a brother arms which open for them when they are in trouble. I have not so much as a tombstone upon which I can read my name and weep. Other men have a country. I have none, for I belong to no family. One name meant to me everything that I possessed, and that name, your name, I am forbidden to pronounce. The lady reminds him of social obligations. Call them duties or call them prejudices. Such as they are, they exist. Why, he replies, should I submit to these laws? Not one among those by whom they were made has spared me a suffering or done me a service. I have received nothing but injustice, and I owe nothing but hatred. My unfortunate mother's shame has been branded on my forehead. Adele loves Antony but avoids him. In the course of a journey she takes, she has to spend a night at an inn. He surprises her there and takes possession of her with violence. In spite of this dastardly act, she continues to love him. We meet the couple again in Paris. Their story is known. We hear hypocritical women who manage to combine secret leanings to the forbidden with irreproachable outward behavior, destroying Adele's reputation. Their attacks on her evoke outbursts of indignation from the really worthy, indignation against society and its hypocrisies. But the drama is drawing to a close. The husband, Colonel de Hervé, returns from a journey. Antony tries in vain to persuade Adele to escape with him. The step of the injured husband is heard in the anteroom. The lover draws his romantic dagger and plunges it into Adele's breast. To save her honor, he meets de Hervé with the cry, "El me resistate, gli assassini." What chiefly strikes us now on reading the play is its preposterous absurdity. We feel that if we were to see it acted, as a new play, we should not be able to refrain from smiling at the parts intended to touch us. We can hardly understand today how it happened that, on the night of its first performance in 1831, a select audience were excited by it to the wildest enthusiasm. They applauded, shed tears, sobbed, shouted bravo. The effect of the play was heightened by the splendid acting of Bocage and Marie Dorval. Dumas tells that a handsome green coat he was wearing was positively torn off his back and into scraps, which were preserved as relics by the enthusiastic youths who formed a large proportion of the audience. And even if we do not take this anecdote quite literally, there is no doubt of the unboundedness of the enthusiasm. The explanation is that men never laugh at a work which gives expression to their own moods and feelings. Antony was not merely the impersonation of passion verging on savagery, in combination with a tenderness so great that it would rather take upon itself the responsibility of a murder than expose the beloved one to insult and scorn. He was also the Byronic, mysterious young hero who is predestined to struggle against the injustice of fate and is greater than his fate. But even in those days there were not wanting critics who saw the weaknesses of the play. Bocage, who acted Antony, considered the closing speech so foolish that he would have omitted it if he could. He did omit it one evening, and the curtain fell without it, but only with the result that the audience began to shout and scream as if possessed. They would not be defrauded of their speech. Bocage had gone, but Madame Dorval, who was still lying dead upon the stage, had the presence of mind to order the curtain to be raised again. Upon which, holding up her head, she said with a smile and a transposition of the pronouns, G. lui resistais, il emma assassini. One sharply satirical voice was raised within the precincts of the romantic camp. Let anyone interested turn up the long and excellent criticism of Antony in Jules Janin's Histoire de la littérature dramatique. Undoubtedly, the best piece of criticism its author ever wrote, and he will have the pleasure of beholding delirious romanticism overwhelmed with ridicule. Whilst Antony may be described as the romantic fit of hysterics, Chatterton, the one play of Alfred de Vigny's which was a success on the stage, may be designated the romantic dirge. These two favorite dramas of the generation of 1830 complement each other. The one represents the cult of genius, the other the cult of passion, the one sympathy with the suffering, the other admiration for energetic action, or, to go deeper, the one the Teutonic, the other the Latin side of romanticism. Alfred de Vigny, born 1799, had failed to win the approbation of the theatriguing public by his excellent historical drama, La Merchel d'Ancre, which was put on the stage in 1834. The reason probably was that in everything essential its characters belonged to those types with which the public had already become familiar in other romantic historical tragedies. Borgia, the lover, for instance, is of exactly the same species as Victor Hugo's lovers, and is not even very different from the lover of Dumas plays, in spite of the widely different characters of the two authors. This shows us the power of a school to set its stamp upon writers of the most varied individualities. Chatterton, on the other hand, is a work peculiarly characteristic of de Vigny. This play, which was performed in 1835, is based on an idea to which its author had already given expression, in three different forms, in a volume of tales entitled Stello, published 2 years previously. The idea of the true poet's unhappy and neglected position in modern society. De Vigny, to begin with, regarded the poet from the romantic standpoint, regarded him, that is to say, as a superior being, nay, as the noblest of all beings, the idea with which the German Romanticists, too, were so thoroughly impregnated, and a feeling of strong compassion had been aroused in him by the poet's fate, especially the fate of the young poet who, when he stands most in need of help and appreciation, so seldom finds hearts that understand him and patrons who prevent his life being a struggle for existence. What lent a certain charm to de Vigny's constant appeal to the public on behalf of the poet was the fact that he was not pleading his own cause, for he was a man of good family who had always been in comfortable circumstances. According to his idea, the poet is a poor unfortunate who is entirely in the power of his own imagination. He is incapable of everything except fulfilling his divine mission, and especially incapable of earning money. It is possible for him, indeed, to make a living by writing, but if he does so, it is probably at the cost of his noblest gifts. He develops his critical faculty at the expense of his imagination, and the divine spark which burns in him is extinguished. Therefore, this heavenly messenger ought not to be allowed to degrade himself by common work. His brain is a volcano, from which the harmonious lava laves harmony uses can only issue when he is in a position to be idle as long as he pleases. There is, as the modern reader sees at once, some truth in this idea, but more exaggeration. The play which was based on it, and which produced floods of tears, appeals so exclusively to the instinct of compassion that it has no properly tragic effect, and it has too strong a lyric bias in favor of its hero to possess the inward equilibrium without which a drama lacks stability. Chatterton and the young quackeress whom he loves have appropriated every single noble quality of mind and soul. Around them there is nothing but coarseness, cold-heartedness, prose, and stupidity. What we are shown is the cruel treatment of the intellectual genius by the coarse, earthbound world around him. The view of life is not unlike what we find in Germany in the writings of Novalis, in Denmark in those of Andersen and in Gemmen. For authors such as these Goethe has written his Tasso in vain. We in our day are tired of the dramas with artist heroes which were ushered in by Oehlenschläger's Correggio, and are represented in Germany by Holte's Lorbeerbaum und Bettelstab, 100. We no longer indignantly sympathize with Chatterton, the man who has been created to descry in the stars the way pointed out by the finger of the Lord, when he chooses rather to poison himself than accept an unpoetical appointment which would bring him in 100 a year. In this case also, what touched every heart in an audience of the year 1835 now only elicits a smile and a shrug of the shoulders. Romanticism was too essentially lyric to produce dramatic works of enduring value. This fact is perhaps most strongly borne in upon us when we consider the plays of the greatest of the Romantic lyric poets. Victor Hugo's dramas have many points of resemblance with Oehlenschläger's tragedies. We frequently observe that both authors have been influenced by their reading. In Hugo's Marie Tudor, we trace the influence of Dumas' Christina Fontainebleau, and the last scene of Lucrece Borgia owes something to Webster's Duchess of Malfi. The characters in the plays of both authors are merely outlined. In neither are they real, complete human beings, and yet the power of genuine enthusiasm and lyric pathos inspires them with life. Hugo's characters certainly approach nearer to real life, and for this reason, that events such as those represented in his plays had occurred in France in much more recent times than in Denmark. Hernani reminds us of the rebel leaders who defied the government in La Vendée. Gilbert, who goes to the scaffold of his own free will to avenge the woman he loves, does no more than many a noble victim of the guillotine had done. And Ruy Blau's elevation from the position of a footman to that of a minister of state is not much more remarkable than Rousseau's rise from the same position to that of one of the world's most famous authors. This, however, practically makes little difference, for the author's love of the unusual, nay, of the monstrous, represses everything which might remind us of the reality with which we are familiar, and gives prominence to unnatural phenomena which, though sublime in his eyes, are merely absurd in the eyes of readers of a later day. The conception of human nature which reveals itself in Hugo's plays is purely lyric. It reminds us in all essentials of the psychology of his rival, Lamartine, an author who was such a contrast to him in other respects. The only difference is that, whilst Lamartine, with his harmonious nature, loves to represent a pure and beautiful character which yields to some sudden temptation, and then expiates the one weak moment with years of repentance and penance. Jocelyn, Cedar and La Chute dun Ange. Hugo in his dramas loves to represent a human soul debased by bad passions, by all kinds of misery and humiliations, by vice, by slavery, by infirmity, yet so constituted that, under given circumstances, it is irresistibly attracted by the good and beautiful, in alliance with which it fights against the horrible past which it has forsworn. This soul aspires. It understands even the most delicate refinements of the good and beautiful, but it feels unworthy of the noble emotions which it experiences. It cannot mount into these unfamiliar regions, and so it falls back, exhausted and defeated, into its former degraded condition. Let me illustrate my meaning by a few examples. Tribalite Leroy Essemeuse has been corrupted by his position as the unscrupulous mouthpiece and butt of mockery, yet he loves his daughter with the purest tenderness. She is stolen from him, and he gives himself up entirely to hatred and projects of revenge. Marion Delorme has sold herself hundreds of times, but she falls in love with a young, brave man, and this passion completely purifies her. Didier is condemned to death, and in the dread hour of trial she becomes Marion again. She gives herself to the judge in order to save the man she loves, not understanding that Didier would far rather die than be saved thus. Lucrece Borgia was begotten in crime, and has lived a life of crime. But this licentious woman, this poisoner, has a son whom she loves, and for his sake she is prepared to renounce the life she has hitherto led. But a mortal insult is offered her, and in her fury she has recourse to her old weapons. She invites her enemies to a repast, gives them poison, and unwittingly murders her son along with the others. Rai Blas, compelled by poverty, has become a nobleman's lackey. The love of a queen makes of this lackey a minister of state. He is fit for the position. He evolves and carries out great and noble plans. He is on the point of becoming the savior of his country, when his past rises up against him. The disappointment of all his hopes is too much for him. He revenges himself like the man he was. He will not fight a duel with his master, but gets possession of his sword and kills the defenseless man with it. The conception of the tragic is, we observe, always the same. But of chief significance in all these dramas, as far as Hugo is concerned, is the fountain of lyric pathos which wells forth when the degraded human soul is raised by noble passion from the mire. The real kernel of the drama is in every case the hymn of strong emotion with which the guilt-stained soul sings itself pure. One of Hugo's most famous poems, Les Chants du Crépuscule, 32, contains an allegory of which we are reminded when considering his dramas. High in a church tower so he writes an old bell. Long ago its metal was clean and bright. The only inscription it bore was the word God, with a crown below it. But the tower has had many visitors, and each of them, one with his blunt knife, another with a rusty nail, has scratched his own mean name, or a foul word, or a silly witticism, or a platitude on the bell. It is covered with dust and cobwebs. Rust has found its way into the scratches, marring and corroding it. Mais quimport à la cloche et quimport à mon aim. Qua sun hura, a sun jour, el esprit saint les reclame. Les touche elunet elauter et leur d'ici, chantes. Saudain, partout voyet de tous les côtes. De leur sein ébranle, rempli d'ombres obscures. A travers leur surface, a travers leurs suilures. Et la sender et la rue, amas injuria. Quelques chose de grande s'épandre dans la sia. The poet was only attempting to describe the condition of his own soul when he sang thus. But he did more, for the allegory strikingly depicts the outbursts of lyric pathos, which escape from the lips of the unhappy and guilt-stained characters who give his dramas their interest. But pathos and lyric sonority, in however ample measure, are not materials out of which alone a dramatic edifice can be constructed. A strong foundation of accurate reasoning is demanded, or, failing this, at least of sound common sense and correct taste. Such foundations Hugo could not supply, and his failings as a dramatist increased with time. There happened in his case what happens with so many artists. His style degenerated into mannerism. He became, as it were, his own best pupil. As a dramatist, he ended by parodying himself the most cruelly effective kind of parody. He had always been wanting in a sense of the comic, and had always been inclined to confuse the sublime with the colossal. To this inclination, he yielded more unrestrainedly than ever before in writing Les Burgraves. The very list of characters evokes a smile. Job, Burgrave of Heppenhef, aged 100. Magnus, son of Job, aged 80. Hatto, son of Magnus, aged 60. Gorlois, son of Hatto, aged 30. A Parisian caricature of the Burgraves of about the same date as the play represents them standing in a row, decreasing in height and quantity of beard according to age. The centenarian is the most energetic of them all. He represents the good old days. He calls his son of 80, young man, but Hugo does not smile. All these old gentlemen vie in declamation with a beggar of 90, who turns out to be no less a personage than Frederick Barbarossa, who has lived in concealment for 20 years, but has come to execute vengeance upon the eldest of the Burgraves, who, as a youth, had plotted against his life. The play teems with improbabilities and romantic absurdities. For instance, in order to bring about a recognition scene, Hugo makes a soldier fight with a piece of red-hot iron, with which he sets a mark upon an opponent whom he wishes to be able to recognize again, and whom he cannot see rightly because it is dark. When this monstrous production of an overstrained imagination was put upon the stage, in 1843, it proved a complete failure. On the first night, in the middle of the play, hissing began. One of Hugo's faithful henchmen rushed to tell him. Hugo, who, like Napoleon, relied upon his guard, answered as usual, "Get hold of some young men?" It is said that the messenger answered despondently, with downcast eyes, "There are no more young men." The generation to which Romanticism had appealed 13 years before was no longer young, and, what was worse, it had grown weary. More than one of its poets had made too heavy demands upon it. A reaction was inevitable, and it set in that very year. It found its author and its histrionic genius. A young man as yet unknown to fame had left the provincial town in which he had been brought up, and come to Paris with a manuscript in his pocket. He was a thoroughly high-principled young man, with no great gift of imagination, but with much refinement and taste, and of a nobly serious turn of mind. His name was Francois Ponsard, and the title of the manuscript was Lucrece. It was a tragedy on an antique theme of rape and death of the chaste Lucretia. The style was sober and severe. It recalled Racine's. The public was tired of the romantic style. For long, the quiet citizen had shaken his head over such phrases of Hugo's as the tones purled from the organ like water from a sponge, or the table linen was white as pale grief's winding sheet, or the old woman walked with bent, slow back. But until now, there had been no one capable of competing with Hugo. Here at last seemed to be a possible rival. At the first glance, Ponsard's play appeared to be exactly on the lines of the old classical tragedy. In their eagerness, its welcomers did not notice in what a modern manner the antique theme was treated, how much Ponsard had learned from the Romanticists, how much of its warm coloring his drama, ode to Victor Hugo, and how small an amount of originality the newcomer really possessed. All the public saw was that this drama was sane and simple. They saw that its heroine was Lucretia, not Hugo's horrible Lucrece, that monster of bloodthirstiness and sensuality, but Rome's Lucretia, the emblem of chastity, another name for feminine purity. She represented marriage, the family, the poetry of home, as Antony and his kin had represented the morality of the foundling and lawlessness. All Catholic and classic France, all Orthodox Switzerland, hymned the praises of the new dramatist and his play. At last, Hugo had found his superior, Racine his equal. Even the critical Vinet joined in the great hallelujah. He went into ecstasies over Ponsard's style. This author spins gold as his Lucretia does wool 100. Les Burgraves was hissed on the 7th of March, 1843. On the 22nd of April of the same year, Lucrece was received on its first night with thunders of applause. So closely as this did the short-lived triumph of what went by the name of L'École du Bon Sens follow on the defeat of romantic dramaticism. If the worthy Ponsard relied upon the verdict of his critics, Janin and the others, Théophile Gautier and Théophile Dandy alone, protested. He must have believed that his fame was established for all time. The classic reaction had found its actress as well as its dramatist. In 1838, a young Jewess had made her debut in the Theatre Francais. She was then 18, an ignorant child who had played the harp and sung in the cafes and in the streets, but time proved Rachel to be a genius, the greatest actress France had ever known. And this great actress, as it happened, had a thorough distaste for the roles with which the romantic drama provided her. Whilst she studied and played those of the old classic repertory, with such zeal and passion that she actually succeeded in doing what no one had believed possible, namely, restoring their power of attraction to the tragedies which the Romantic school had disdainfully driven from the stage. Of what avail was it that Gautier wrung his hands? Iphigenie, Merope, Emilia, Chimene, Fetter again trod the boards. And so nobly and naturally were they personated that an impressionable public was at times actually roused to a kind of fury with the authors and critics who had dared to throw contempt on these sacred national treasures. A nation is naturally rejoiced to learn that it has not been mistaken in the eminence of the men and works it has reverenced for centuries. Although the title role of Lucrece had been written for her, Rachel at first refused to play it, but after the success of the drama at the Odeon, she consented. The mood of the audience the first time she appeared in it has been described to me by an eyewitness. We sat waiting in breathless expectation for the curtain to rise. It rose, and we saw Rachel as Lucretia sitting at her spinning wheel among her maidens. The silence had been complete enough before, but when she raised her head and opened her lips to say the first words to one of the slaves, Levitoi, Laodis, there was such utter stillness that the fruit sellers were heard crying their oranges in the marketplace. In their enthusiasm for Rachel, the public did not realize that the classic style in art was not really alive, because a single genius for a time breathed life into the great works of a bygone age, and in their rejoicing over Ponsard, they failed to understand how short his triumph must inevitably be. The common sense school, as its name prognosticates, never developed any vigorous originality. Ponsard himself was a writer of only second-rate talent. The youthful dramas of his gifted follower, Émile Augier, who dedicated his poems to him, imitate his sober spirit and style, but Augier's style changed as time went on. Though the school, most praiseworthy in its intentions, by no means deserved the contemptuous attacks made on it by some of the irreconcilable younger romanticists, including Thackeray and Theodore de Banville, yet its historical significance is no more than it indicates the period when romantic drama had outlived itself. Roman 33. Literature in its relation to the social and political movements of the day. Meanwhile, Saint-Simonism had been thoroughly leavening literature. Lamartine, the most gifted of the authors who, after the restoration of the hereditary monarchy, lent their support to the Conservative Party, began to waver early in the 30s. In his versified novel, Jocelyn, mild and pious though its tone is, we are conscious of his new sympathies and of new developments in his convictions. In the preface, he evades the question of his religious belief, merely remarking that, let it be what it may, he has not forgotten his youthful reverence for the Church. The most careless reader, however, cannot fail to observe that the story itself is a protest against the celibacy of the clergy, one of the fundamental principles of the Church. And in Jocelyn's diary, we find the following significant passage, in the entry for 21st September 1800. La caravane humaine, un jour edate campi. Dans les forts bordant une rive escarpie. Et ni pouvant pauser, sa route plus avant. Les chiens elaboratent du solil et du vent. Les tents, aux ramox en lacant leurs cordages. Formiant autour des troncs des sites, des villages. Et les hommes épars sur des gazons épais. Mangiant leur pain, a l'ombre et conversiant en paix. Tauta coup comet attaints d'une rage insensi. Ces hommes si levant à la mime pensi. Portant la haque aux troncs, font cruller à leur pays. Ces domes, o les nids essentiant multiplies. Et les brutes des boys sortant de leurs repairs. Et les oiseaux fiant les cimes séculaires. Contemplant la ruine avec un il de horreur. Ni comprendient pas l'œuvre et maudissant du cœur. Cette race stupide acharnie à sa perte. Qui détruit jusqu'au ciel l'ombre qui la couverte. Or, pendant quen leur nuit les brutes des forts. Avient pity de l'homme et setient de regrets. L'homme continuant sun, ravage sublime. Avait git les troncs anarchie sur l'abîme. Sur l'arbre de ses boards, gisant et renverse. La fleuve edate partout, couvert et traverse. Et poursuivant en paix sun, eternal voyage. La caravane avait conquis l'autre rivage. But this was only the beginning. La chute d'un and showed, in spite of all its faults, that Lamartine had discarded his earlier seraphic style, and his first parliamentary speeches showed that Saint-Simonistic ideas had gradually supplanted his orthodox beliefs. The born aristocrat proclaimed himself a democrate conservateur, desirous of the realization, under a constitutional monarchy, of all the modern liberal and progressive ideas. And he did not stop even here. His famous Histoire des Girondins, published in 1846, a work valueless as history, but written in a most poetical, persuasively eloquent style, was the book which more than any other attuned men's minds to revolution and prepared for the coming upheaval. And in 1848, we find the man who had been the court poet of the Restoration period, standing the real chief of the Republican the balcony of the Hotel de Ville, displaying the proud indifference of the aristocrat to the muskets leveled at his breast, while addressing the crowd with the authoritative eloquence of the tribune. That was a great, an immortal moment in his life, when he saved the lives of his colleagues and averted civil war with a few unhesitating words, as beautiful as they were manly. It was Pierre Leroux who initiated George Sand into the new, fermenting social ideas, which with feminine impulsiveness she at once adopted. In his capacity of social reformer, Pierre Leroux, a metaphysician with a noble heart and a confused brain, who thought in triads in the manner of Schelling, championed equality and progress. To him, progress meant approach towards equality. He was instigated to his attempts at reform by his indignation with the existing condition of society, with the equality as regarded the law, which permitted the rich man to escape the hardship of military service and the punishment due to his crime, with the liberty which consisted in the right of free competition, that is to say, the legal right of the rich to oppress the poor. Society, as reorganized by Leroux, was to be based on the triple nature of man. Man is constituted of perception, intuition, and cognition. To these three elements were to correspond three classes: the artisan or industrial, the artist, and the scientist class. But these three classes were not, as in Saint Simon's imaginary society, to be castes, but were to act in unison. Three individuals or units, one from each class, were to constitute a society individual or unit, and these same three, working together, would constitute an atelier. The ateliers also were to be divided into three classes, according to the activity which predominated in them, 100. When we think of all these utopias, we cannot but admire the sane and wise attitude maintained towards them by the authors who allowed themselves to be carried away by some of the ideas inspiring the different systems. They held aloof from everything, or almost everything, that was artificial, fantastic, or absurd. They contented themselves with kindling their poetic torches at the altar fire, kept alight by the pure-hearted enthusiasts. They drew inspiration from the philanthropy of these men, from their ardent championship of the poor and the oppressed, from their fervent faith in the people and in progress. It is quite evident, whatever may be said to the contrary, that Saint Simonism was a beneficent influence in George Sand's life. It produced tranquility after the fit of despair which dictated Lelia. It gave her a faith which was never afterwards disturbed, and a cause to work and fight for. She had an observant eye for all that was going on around her, and towards the close of the 30s it was evident that the French working classes were in a state of violent ferment. At that period, the slow transformation of France, from an almost exclusively agricultural country to one of the chief manufacturing countries, was already an accomplished fact. It was now no longer only the poverty of the peasants which called for a remedy, but also, and even more urgently, the poverty and discontent of the ever-increasing proletariat population of the great manufacturing and commercial towns. Like almost all the other French democratic writers, George Sand turned her attention to the working people of the towns, their hard struggle for existence, their remarkable intelligence, their social and political ideas. Saint Simonism had originally appealed to her and aroused her enthusiasm by its condemnation of the relations between the sexes upheld by the conventions of existing society. It denned as truths to be proclaimed, and championed the ideas which were most precious to her, that there is no beauty or value in marriage except when it is a voluntary union, and that mayor, witnesses, and priest cannot invest it with greater sacredness than do love and conscience. Now Saint Simonism gave a more thoughtful and more definite character to her love of the people. Among the men of the working classes, she discovered more unselfishness and manliness than among those of the middle classes. It began to seem to her as if the vices of the male sex which she had condemned with such severity in her first novels were in reality more the vices of a class than of the whole sex. And her love of the working class, in conjunction with the innate idealism of her nature, led her to see and represent the working man from an ideal point of view. She produced a series of novels in which the old contrast between two men of the same class, one unselfish and the other a hardened egotist, was superseded by the contrast between the idealized representative of the working classes and a more or less egotistical and slavishly conventional representative of the upper or middle classes. The most interesting books of this series are the two written about 1840 Horace, The Refusal to Accept, which produced a temporary disagreement between George Sand and the Revue des Deux Mondes, and Le Compagnon du Tour de France, a genuine labor question novel, which in its innocence and simple purity presents a striking contrast to the glaringly colored stories of a socialistic and democratic tendency, published a few years later by Eugene Sue. In my opinion, Horace is one of George Sand's best books. In its hero, she represents with more shrewdness and profundity than ever before or after the young bourgeois of the reign of Louis Philippe. The acuteness and insight she in this case displays are in no way inferior to Balzac's. She is inspired by a strong antipathy, which, however, does not preclude a good-humoredly tolerant treatment, With Horace is contrasted the noble proletarian Arsene. This man, originally a painter, has been compelled by poverty to take a place as waiter in a cafe, but the dependent position has not degraded him. The simple goodness and beauty of his character make him most attractive. We believe in him. Arsene has friends among the Bousingets, the circle of young students who in the 30s transferred the style and deportment of the Romantic school to the domain of politics. They figure in many of the lithographs of the period with their Robespierre waistcoats, thick sticks, and glazed hats or red velvet caps. In outward appearance, they somewhat resembled German corps students, and they took part in all riots which were demonstrations of discontent with the Just-Milieu government. George Sand defends them warmly. None of the men, she says, who at that time caused a slight disturbance of public order need blush now at the thought of having displayed a little youthful ardor. If the only use which youth can make of such nobility and courage as it possesses is to attack society with it, the condition of society must be very bad. Arsene fights like a hero and is badly wounded in the workingmen's revolt of the 5th of June, 1832, which is sympathetically described. And in the course of a few years he becomes an experienced, able politician. The story of his political education is peculiarly interesting to us, because, in telling it, the authoress gives unambiguous expression to her own feelings. Arsene's hero is Godefroy Cavaignac. George Sand describes him and his friends, the society less amis du people. Their ideas, she writes, at any rate indicated a great advance upon the liberalism of the Restoration period. The other Republicans were a little too much taken up with the idea of overthrowing monarchy, and did not give sufficient thought to the laying of the foundations of the Republic. Godefroy Cavaignac's thoughts were of the emancipation of the people, of free education, of universal suffrage, of the gradual modification of the rights of property. 100. Horace's cold-heartedness and narrow-mindedness display themselves in his contemptuously sweeping condemnation of Saint-Simonism, which to him is pure charlatanism. He is incapable of appreciating its conception of the mutual relations of the sexes, and is obliged to submit to being reproved with the calmness of conscious superiority by a young dressmaker who lives with her friend, a clever young doctor, and regards this life of theirs as the truly religious marriage. The authoress undoubtedly attacks in this novel more problems than she is capable of solving, but the very fact of its dealing largely with the ideas and aims of the day gives it a vivid and attractive historical coloring. Besides, it was not her business, as a novelist, to solve social problems, but to show how they moved hearts and set brains to work, even the hearts and brains of enamored young women and self-satisfied young men. What I specially admire in Le Compagnon du Tour de France, a book which, as a novel, is inferior to Horace, is the impulsive strength of the feeling which inspired it. To feel the heart swell and burn with compassion for the unfortunates of society, to feel burdened by the favors which fortune has bestowed on us, and not on all, are sensations with which many a youth and maiden are familiar. But it is a rare thing indeed for the man or woman of 40 still to hunger and thirst after justice for others, to be unable to sit still and see the yoke weighing down the innocent neck, unable to refrain from planning and striving after a different order of things, different morality from that which seems to satisfy society in general, nay, to be actually ashamed to sleep or to take pleasure or to be happy for a few moments, as long as things are as they are. And these were the feelings which compelled George Sand to write this book. What a love for the people lies at the foundation of it. And it is a love for the people as they are for the drinking, brawling people, as well as for the working, aspiring peoplia, love so great that the authoress cannot bear to describe or dwell upon the vices she sees and names. See the conversations in chapter 25. The best definition of the idea which dominates the book is to be found in the book itself. A nobleman asserts that he holds the old opinion that everything possible ought to be done for the people, but that they ought not to be consulted, because that would make them both appealing party and judge. His daughter answers, "And is not that just what we are?" Soon after writing this work, George Sand began to take a vigorous share in the practical politics of the day. After her quarrel with the Revue des Deux Mondes, she had, in collaboration with Pierre Leroux, Viardot, Laymanise, and the Polish author Mickiewicz, started the Revue Independente. Now in 1843, she and some friends started a Republican provincial newspaper in her own part of the country. In this paper, L'Éclaireur de l'Inder, to which Lamartine also contributed, she defended the cause, now of the town artisan, now of the peasant article on the Paris journeyman bakers, letters from a Black Forest peasant. In 1844, in her long essay, Questions politiques et sociales, she distinctly declared herself a socialist. When the revolution broke out in 1848, she was ripe to take part in it. For a short time, she published a weekly paper, La Cause du Peuple. She wrote a word to the middle classes and the famous letters to the people, and composed the bulletins of the provisional government. Towards the close of the year, in face of threatening danger, her Republican socialism assumed an almost fanatical form. The article La Majorité et l'Unanimité, in which, immediately before the elections for the Constituent National Assembly, she exhorts the electors to show their liberal principles by their votes, ends with the threat, expressed with much circumlocution, but yet plain enough, that if the assembly presently to be elected by universal suffrage does not prove to be such an assembly as popular interests demand, mere still remains the appeal to arms. It is curious to see the champion of the sovereignty of the people having recourse to a threat of despotically violent measures. It shows what a vigorous, ardent, manly spirit dwelt in the bosom of this gifted woman. The same indomitable energy which produced hundreds of novels displayed itself in her alliance with Ledru Rollin and Louis Blanc, men who were content with thinking what she gave expression to in words. It was chiefly through Lamennais that the current of democratic ideas reached Victor Hugo. In Lamennais' principal work, Essai sur l'Indifference, there were already signs indicating the possibility of a rejection of that principle of authority which he had championed so ardently in his youth. In August 1832, his theories were condemned by the Pope. The intimate relations between Lamennais and Hugo began in the latter's youth. Lamennais congratulated Hugo on the occasion of his marriage, and Hugo's first odes were dedicated to Lamennais. In 1822, persuaded by the Abbé de Rohan, Hugo determined to unburden his mind to a father confessor. The first he went to was Freycinus, once the intrepid, self-sacrificing cure, now the fashionable Paris clergyman, a bishop and head of the university. Hugo was repelled by Freycinus' worldly ideas and counsels, and the abbé then sent him to the little, frail, slender man with the yellow face, hooked nose, and beautiful, restless eyes, who walked the streets of Paris in a shabby cassock, blue woolen stockings, and hobnailed shoes, the famous Lamennais, whom he already knew so well. The ideas of both confessor and penitent underwent a change in the course of the years preceding the Revolution of July, and the one was not long after the other in going over to the liberal and anti-clerical party. One evening in September 1830, Lamennais, entering Hugo's room, found him writing. "I am disturbing you," said Lamennais. "No, but you will not approve of what I am writing. Never mind, let me hear it." And Hugo read the following lines from his journal D'un Revolutionnaire de 1830. "The republic which is not yet ripe, but which in a century will embrace the whole of Europe, signifies that society is its own sovereign. It protects itself by means of its citizen soldiers, judges itself by trial by jury, administers its own affairs by local government, rules itself by popular representation. The four limbs of monarchy, the standing army, the courts, the bureaucracy, the peerage for the republic, only four troublesome excrescences which are withering up and will soon die." "You have one clause too many," said Lamennais, "that which asserts that the republic is not ripe. You speak of it in the future tense, I in the present." A few years later, Lamennais' connection with the Roman Catholic Church was at an end. It was in order to show that his defection was not the result of unbelief, but of a new conviction, that he entitled his famous manifesto Paroles d'un Croyant. It has been averred that no book since the invention of printing had created such a stir as this 999. In the course of a few years, 100 editions of it were printed. It was published in foreign countries and translated into many languages. It is an imitation of a work which appeared not long before it, Mickiewicz' Book of the Polish Pilgrim. Half in Old Testament, half in Christian style, it denounces monarchy in Europe, the Pope and the priesthood, those to whom the fall of Poland and the serfdom of Italy were due, and the self-interested bourgeois government of France. The eloquence is of the genuine sacerdotal type. The book is strong in pathos but weak in psychology. It only condemns and praises, knows no shade between black and white, of the blackness of hell, the whiteness of heaven. Nevertheless, its author's warm-heartedness, purity of motive, and beauty of soul have imparted to it a rare charm. In 1837 followed Livre du Peuple, a work written in the same spirit. The bold abbé was imprisoned, but from his prison he sent book after book out into the world. Une voix du prison, du passe et de l'avenir du peuple, de l'esclavage moderne were all written in Saint Pélagie. Lamennais died 3 years before the Revolution of February, at a time of violent political and social agitation. I give a few fragments from Paroles, d'un Croyant as specimens of his style. "Ne vous laissez pas tromper par de vaines paroles. Plusieurs chercheront à vous persuader, que vous eats vraiment libres, parce quils, orant écrit sur une fuel de papier le mot de libert, et l'orant affiche à tous les carrefours. La libert en est, pas placard quan lit au coin de la rue. Elle est une puissance vivante quan sent en soi et odeur de soi, le génie predicteur du foyer domestique, la garantie des droits sociaux, et le premier de ces droits. El oppresseur qui s'y couvre de son nom est le pire des oppresseurs. Il joint le mensonge à la tyrannie, et à l'injustice la profanation, car le nom de la libert est saint. Gardez-vous de ce qui descent, libert, et qui la détruisent par leurs œuvres. Le laboureur porte le poids du jour, et s'expose à la pluie, au soleil, aux vents, pour préparer par son travail la moisson qui remplira ses greniers à l'automne. La justice est la moisson des pupils. L'artisan s'y lève avant l'aube, allume sa petite lampe, et fatigue sans relâche pour gagner un peu de pain qui le nourrisse, lui et ses enfants. La justice est le pain des pupils. Le marchand n'y refuse aucun labour, ni s'y plaint d'aucuns pains. Il use son corps et oublie le sommeil, afin d'amasser des richesses. La libert est la richesse des pupils. Le matelot traverse les mers, si liver aux flots et aux tempêtes, si hasard entre les écuelles, souffre le froid et le chaud, afin de s'assurer quelque repose dans ses viands. La libert est le repose des pupils. Le soldat si soumet aux plus dures privations, il veille et combat, et dans son sang, pour si qu'il appelle la gloire. La libert est la gloire des pupils. Est-il est un pupil qui estime moins la justice, et la libert que le laboureur sa moisson, et l'artisan un peu de pain, le marchand les richesses, le matelot le repose et le soldat la gloire. Élèves odeur de si pupil unot murel, afin que son halin en infect par le resté de la terre. June soldat au vastu. G vise combatter pour la justice, pour la sainte cause des pupils, pour les droits sacres du genre humain. Quates armes soyant benis, June soldat. June soldat au vastu. G vise combatter contre les hommes iniques pour suquils, renversant et foulant aux pides, contre les maîtres pour les esclaves, contre les tyrants pour la liberte. Quates armes soyant benis, June soldat. June soldat au vastu. G vise combatter pour renverser les barrières qui séparent les pupils, et les empêchant de s'embrasser, comme les fils du même père, destinés à vivre unis dans un même amour. Quates armes soyant benis, June soldat. June soldat au vastu. G vise combatter pour affranchir de la tyrannie de l'homme la pensée, la parole, la conscience. Quates armes soyant benis, sept fois benis, June soldat. Idealistic and monotonous as these utterances and refrains are, they possess the kind of eloquence which makes a powerful impression upon the common people. Laymanized outbursts of revolutionary sentiment come very near to being pure poetry. Hugo's are pure poetry. In reading his verses written in the 40s, we feel how his poet's ear hears the dull, underground rumbling of the approaching revolution, and how he foresees that its crater will open in Paris. As far back as in the preface to the Fuels.ni, he reproaches England with having turned Ireland into a graveyard, the sovereigns of Europe with having made Italy a prison for galley slaves, the Tsar with having populated Siberia with Poles. In it, too, he already writes of the old religions which are sloughing their skins, and alluding to Saint Simonism of the new, which are stammeringly enunciating their half-reasonable, half-false principles. And from this time onward, he is in all his works the champion of the liberty of the people, of their right to self-government, and of the religion of humanity. As a dramatist, he began by rebelling merely against the accepted laws of style. But ere long he was, like Voltaire a century earlier, making the drama the organ of his ideas. One of his plays, Le Roi et sa Muse, is an attack upon absolute monarchy, as represented by Francis I, the most brutal of the royal debauchees of France. Another, Angelo, the preface to which is an affirmation of genuine Saint Simonistic principles, contrasts woman within the pale of society with her sister beyond it, endows the strolling actress with virtues which the great lady lacks, and gives each of them her own ideality. A third, Rivalries, symbolizes the elevation of the lowest class to supreme power. In Moliere's Les Precieuses, the lackey was treated like some animal which, however clever it might be, was liable to be thrashed, even when it had only carried out its master's orders. Shortly before the Great Revolution, Scapin is transformed into Figaro, who, though still in livery, openly manages his masters. In Blas the servant, that is to say, the born plebeian, throws off his livery, assumes authority, and rules. While fully conscious of the great improbabilities and weaknesses of these dramas, we are also sensible of the atmosphere of new ideas which pervades them. Hugo's was so dogmatic a mind that each new world of ideas which he entered in the course of his life crystallized itself, for him, into a code of doctrines. From the moment he became a Democrat, he was the opponent of capital punishment. He protested against it as an author in Le Dernier Jour d'un Condamné, and also in Claude Gueux, where a very unpleasant real incident is turned topsy-turvy, and an execrable bandit is transformed into a hero and victim. He protested against it as a private individual. He made personal appeals for the remittance of sentences of death, both to French kings and foreign juries. Though opinion is still, and with good reason, divided as to the advisability of abolishing capital punishment for murder, Hugo's endeavors to save the lives of political offenders have a claim to our undivided sympathy. In 1839, he interceded in behalf of the noble revolutionary, Armand Barbes. Louis-Philippe had, however, in this case remitted the sentence of death before Hugo's verses reached him. But the most beautiful and the only perfectly accurate expression of the mental attitude of France's greatest lyric poet is, naturally, to be found in his poetry. The dramas of his first period, the novels of his second, which do not fall within the scope of this volume, are of small significance in comparison with the poems of the 30s and 40s, which are contained in the two volumes entitled Less Contemplations. In these his faith in progress, his political convictions, his social hopes, his religious feelings, are expressed in the only artistic form which suits them. It is a form which cannot be dissolved, a style which cannot be paraphrased, it must be enjoyed in the original. Hugo had every right to exclaim, as he did in one of the poems of this collection, J.I. dans le livre avec le drame en prose en vers. Played pour les petits et les miserables. Suppliant les heureux et les inexorables. J.I. rehabilite le bouffon, el histrion. Tous les dames humaines, tribulit Marion. Le laquoise, le forquet et la prostitue. J.I. reclaim des droits pour la femme et l'enfant. J.I. tâche d'éclairer el homme en le réchauffant. J.I. criant, science, écriture, parole. J. voulait résorber le bagni par l'école. But he complains. Le passe n'y veut pas en aller, il revient. Sans cesser ses pas, revient, reprend rechant. Elements renegat de hirer, marquis si nom. Demain, my tourne bride et plant l'ile hiver. Usatout ressaisir ses ongles noirs, fate rage. Il gonfle son via flat, souffle son vil orage. Vomit sa vil nuit cry a baz, cry a mort. Pleur ton tempit éclate hurl mord. But the onward movement would not be checked. The cleansing thunderstorm of 1848 broke over Europe. It came that year of earthquakes, that year of emancipation, of heroic struggles and, alas, of romantic childishness when the helm of France was in the hands, not of statesmen, but of poets and enthusiasts. When Saint-Simonistic, neo-Christian, and poetical, instead of practical political ideas prevailed in the councils of the state. How eloquent is such a little fact as this, that one of the first proceedings of the provisional government was at Lamartine's suggestion to declare Negro slavery abolished. The ideas of romantic France find their realization in the Revolution of 1848. Roman 34. The overlooked and forgotten. If we take a survey of any literature some 10 or 12 years after the beginning of a great new movement in it, at the moment when the army of the new era has proved successful in the conflict, we feel as if we were inspecting a battlefield. Through the victor's shouts of triumph, we hear subdued sounds of lamentation. I do not mean the cries of woe that proceed from the vanquished, retreating forces. These have deserved their defeat, and their sufferings inspire no compassion in me. The men I have in my mind are the wounded and the forgotten of the victorious army. For literary warfare, too, has its lists of killed and missing. It is interesting to walk over the battlefield and cast a glance at the writers of the generation of 1830 who were cut off in their youth and strength, or were so severely wounded that, maimed and dumb, they thenceforth only dragged out a disabled existence. The conditions of the literary career are such that, out of hundreds who enter for the race, only 2 or 3 reach the goal. The rest are left lying exhausted along the course. The first to give in are the unfortunates whose powers are undoubtedly inadequate. the men of fragmentary talent who have been enticed by the hope of fortune and fame, and who run on in an atmosphere of dazzling illusion until they sink exhausted and fainting, to awake in the hospital. Next fall those who, though really highly gifted, lack the peculiar combination of qualities indispensable to success in the society in which they live, those who have not the power of adapting themselves to circumstances, much less of molding society to suit their requirements, and who are outrun by the more or less nimble mediocrities in whom the great public recognizes its own flesh and blood. The very character of the work is fatal to many. It is work that knows nothing of days of rest, that exhausts the nervous system, that cannot be done leisurely, because only that which the author produces at white heat has the power of affecting the reader with any of the emotion felt by the writer. It is work which is, as a rule, very badly paid. It is work which, being entirely intellectual, refines the senses of the workman, and heightens his susceptibilities to a degree incompatible with his position and surroundings, yet which at the same time ties him to, incorporates him with, these surroundings, in which he must observe the same rules and conventions as his neighbors. Hence, in the case of many, a thirst for life, for variety, for beauty, for experience, which, remaining unslaked, preys upon the vitals and is called by the world decline or consumption or madness. Others, again, succumb to the difficulties inseparable from the author's position. The equilibrium of society depends at any given moment upon a tacit agreement that the whole truth shall not be openly proclaimed. Yet in every society there exist exceptional individuals whose only task, whose mission, is to speak the whole truth. These are its poets, its authors. Unless these speak the truth, they degenerate into mere sycophantic formalists. Hence the author is perpetually on the horns of a dilemma. He must choose between ignoring what he ought to proclaim a proceeding, which dulls his intellect, and renders him useless, and the dangerous step of speaking out plainly, which makes him the object of such hostility as is only possible in literature. It is a hostility which has at its disposal 1,000 tongues if it desires to speak, but also 1,000 gags if it desires to impose silence concerning an author and his works. And in the case of a man whose very life depends upon publicity, this is the greatest of all dangers, that he may be quietly and treacherously slain with the airgun of silence. All the fatigues, dangers, and difficulties of the author's life were necessarily doubly great in such a period as that of 1830, when, as if at the stroke of an enchanter's wand, a whole group of talented writers appeared on the scene at the same moment, when every youth with any gift of intellect or imagination felt himself drawn to the profession of literature or art, when the renown to be won in these professions seemed as glorious as did military fame in the days of Napoleon, when it was more difficult than ever before to come to the front, and when, moreover, enmity to all conventionality and to the quiet regularity of middle-class life was supposed to be an essential condition of success in art, and the ideal of the literary aspirant was to love and be beloved with a consuming passion, to produce a masterpiece, to scorn or save mankind, and die. When we let our eyes wander over the battlefield where the unrenowned fell, we see them lying in serried rows. There are men of richly gifted, well-developed minds, like Eusebe de Salles, born in Marseille in 1801, Count, doctor, traveler in the East, professor of Arabic, whose Sakuntala Paris is one of the most talented and original psychological novels of the day, but none of whose books reached a second edition, much less brought him fame, and this though he could remember a Sunday evening at Nodier's in his youth, when he and Hugo on equal footing were the heroes of the day. There is Regnier de Stourbet, whose novel Louise, which is dedicated to Janin and perhaps owes something to him, treats a painful subject with discrimination and good taste. There is Charles Doval, killed in a duel at the age of 20, whose collection of poems, La Sylphe, showed talent to which Victor Hugo paid a warm tribute after the author's death. There is the melancholy Eugene Hugo, Victor's elder brother and faithful comrade and friend, who, equipped with a similar though inferior lyric talent to Victor's, fought at his side in the first romantic campaign, but died insane in 1837. There is a man of as remarkable and noble gifts as Fontini, another of Hugo's faithful adherents. Fontini was for a time Secretary of Legation at Madrid. A proud, refined, reserved man, he has told in his novel, Adieu Revue d'Estoumons 1832, the story of one of the romantically sad adventures of his own life. In the life of George Sand, there is an allusion to the unfortunate love affair, which was the cause of his death in 1837. There are men with a refined, delicate poetic talent, like Felix Arvers, whose name now only recalls a single beautiful sonnet, or Lebensky, who is remembered by a single ode, or Ernest Fouinet, who wrote the sonnet Adieu Hero on the margin of a leaf of the edition of Ronsard, which was presented at St. Beuve's suggestion to Victor Hugo by all the authors of the Romantic school, each contributing something to its poetic equipment. Though Fouinet himself is forgotten, one line of his at least. Pourquoi Elenson's parfume il faut que Elenson's brûle should be safe from oblivion, for it conveys in a single metaphor, a single phrase, the whole romantic theory of poetry. There are luckless Saint-Simonist poets like Poyet. There are satirists like Théophile Ferrier, who ridiculed the extravagances of the young romanticists in works in the style of Gaudier's Les Jeunes France, and whose Lord Chatterton is a farcical sequel to de Vigny's drama. And lastly, there are men like Ulrich Göttinger, who is remembered only because of a poem full of enthusiastic admiration addressed to him by the youthful de Musset. To give a somewhat more lifelike impression of these stepchildren of fortune, I shall dwell a little longer on the personality and career of one or two of them, thereby also throwing additional light on the character of the age. For the character of a period often sets its most distinct stamp on the individuals whose peculiarity or extravagance prevents their attaining lasting fame. I take Imbert Galwa first, not because he is greater than the rest, but because he is a typical figure. The son of a Geneva schoolmaster, Imbert displayed remarkable gifts and received an excellent education. He left his native town for Paris without money enough to keep him even for a month, irresistibly attracted by the accounts of the victories of Romanticism, determined to see the men whom he admired so enthusiastically, and if possible to take his place among them as their equal. He soon found his way to the houses of Charles Nodier, the patriarch, Hugo, the chief, and Saint Beuve, the standard-bearer of the new school. Hugo has given a description of his first visit, which I shall condense. It was on a cold October morning in 1827 that a tall young man entered my room. He had on a white, comparatively new overcoat and carried an old hat in his hand. He talked to me of poetry. He had a roll of paper under his arm. I noticed that he kept his feet carefully concealed under his chair. He coughed a little. Next day it rained in torrents, but the young man came back again. He stayed 3 hours, talking eagerly about the English poets, of whose works he knew more than I did. He specially admired the Lake School. He coughed a great deal, and again I noticed that he always kept his feet under the chair. At last I saw that his boots were in holes, and that his feet were soaking. I could not venture to say anything about it. He left without having spoken of anything but the English poets. Galwa thus, as we see, went straight to the most famous authors of the day. His words, his verses showed that there was something in him. He was well received, he was even assisted, and his letters to Geneva betray a naively vain satisfaction in being able to tell what men have received him as their equal and what famous friends he has made. Yet at the same time he was a prey to melancholy. His lot had been cast by destiny in uncongenial surroundings. The great grief of his life was the seemingly fantastic, and yet real one, that he had not been born an Englishman. His mind dwelt on this till it became a kind of mania. He felt that English literature, not French, was his natural element. He read English from morning to night, and his one aim was to make enough money to be able to live in London and become a writer in the English language. When, a year after his arrival in Paris, he was found lying dead on the bed in his miserable room, dead of despair and want, there was an English grammar in his hand. Listen to the tone of his letters. "Oh, my only friend, how unhappy are they who are born unhappy? I had an attack of fever last night. Since I came here my unhappiness has taken 5 or 6 different forms. But the root of all my misery is that I was not born in England. Do not laugh at me, I beg of you. I am so unhappy. I am on terms of friendship with the most famous authors, and have had in their society, when my verses have met with approval, occasional moments of superficial pleasure. But though I can be intoxicated with these little triumphs of an evening, of a moment, my inner life is not only pure wretchedness, it is a cancer. Molten lead flows in my veins. If men could see into my soul, they would pity me. England has everything 50 authors, at least, who have led a life of adventure, and whose books are full of imagination. In France there are not 3. There I should have had a country whose very prejudices I could have loved, for there is so much poetry in the old English customs. An English lady who is giving me lessons says that in 2 years I shall be able to write perfectly well in English. It is a touching illusion. The poor youth who was not yet completely master of his own language, whose odes were often broken-winded, whose verses, artistically polished as they were, lacked life, dreamed of being able in a couple of years to write a foreign language brilliantly. He soon lost confidence in his powers and judged his own poetry much more harshly than it was judged by others, and much more harshly than it deserved. He withdrew into himself, would see no one, and take no interest in what was going on in the outside world. He had come from Geneva interested in everything and everyone, and full of enthusiastic self-confidence. In Paris, he squandered his talent in talk and argument, always a dangerous thing to do, until there was not a virgin, not an untampered with, idea left in his head. Then he became a publisher's hack, and wrote notices of books and biographies until he was completely nauseated. By the time he died, which he did at the age of 22, he had long been utterly indifferent to all general interests and devoid of belief in his own ability. He simply allowed himself to die. I pass on to men of more remarkable and sterling talent, and of them I choose three: Louis Bertrand, Petrus Borel, and Théophile Dandy. These are names which, while their owners were alive, were almost unknown, but which are now familiar to many a lover of literature in France and beyond its borders. In their lifetime, the poor young authors, in the course of a very few years, found it impossible to get their works published. Now, especially since the revival of interest in them due to Charles Asselineau, they are published in editions deluxe. And even the frontispieces and title pages of their first books are carefully imitated, and the books themselves are marked in sale catalogs, valuable and rare. Louis Bertrand, born in 1807 in that town of Dijon, the praises of which he has so charmingly sung, is better known by his pseudonym of Gaspard de la Nuit. He represents more perfectly than any other romanticist one of the main aims of the Romantic endeavor, namely, the renovation of prose style. Whilst his contemporaries were trying to take the world by storm and passionate violence, he was developing in his native town the sculptor's and the goldsmith's artistic qualities in his treatment of language. No one had such an antipathy as he to the conventional phrase, the trite expression. Before he wrote, he, as it were, passed the language through a sieve, which cleansed it of all the dull, faded, worn-out words, leaving to be employed in the service of his art only those possessed of picturesque and musical value. In a poem, there must always be some words which are really only there for the sake of the rhyme or rhythm. The essence of Bertrand's art is that every parasitic word, every scrap of padding, is rigidly excluded. His work belongs to a branch of literature which he himself originated and which others, Baudelaire, for example, cultivated afterwards. He wrote short descriptions, never occupying more than a page or two, now in Rembrandt's, now in Callot's, now in Velvet Bruegel's, now in Gerard Dow's, now in Salvator Rosa's manner. The best of them are as perfect as pictures by these masters. In 1828, during the first, entirely unpolitical period of the Romantic movement, Bertrand assisted in founding a literary organ of its ideas in his native town. His contributions to Le Provincial attracted the attention of the famous Parisians, Chateaubriand, Nodier, and Victor Hugo. And ere long the capital had such an attraction for the young author that he was constantly finding his way there. He made his debut in its literary society one Sunday evening at Charles Nodier's, where he was permitted to read a ballad aloud. In Nodier's house, he made acquaintance with the whole circle. He threw himself specially on the protection of Saint Beuve, who became his mentor, showed him hospitality during his short stays in Paris, and was entrusted with his manuscripts. Bertrand had all the awkwardness of the provincial and the extravagances of the dilettante, but to see the fire of the small, shyly restless black eyes was to divine the poet. Immediately after the Revolution of July, he threw himself ardently into politics, attaching himself to the extreme opposition party. The true son of an old soldier of the Republic and the Empire, he gave vent to the warlike instinct which had hitherto slumbered in his breast in attacks upon the citizen rulers. He was only 23, and a newspaper of the opposite party had treated him with peculiar contempt because of his youth. He compelled the editor of the paper to insert a reply to the offensive article, in which he writes, "I prefer your disdain to your praise, and your approbation would in any case be of little consequence after that with which Victor Hugo, Saint Beuve, Ferdinand Denis, and others have encouraged my literary talent. Your insults oblige me to quote the encomiums with which genius itself has deigned to honor me. Monsieur Victor Hugo writes to me, I read your verses aloud to my friends as I read André Chénier's, Lamartine's, or Alfred de Vigny's. It is impossible to be possessed in a higher degree than you are of the secrets of form. 100, 100. This is how Victor Hugo writes to the man you call a clerk. It is true that I have not the honor of being descended from any noble toad-eater, and that I cannot present myself as a candidate at the elections won. Am not on the list of the most heavily assessed citizens. My father was only a captain of gendarmerie, only a patriot of 1789, a soldier of fortune who at the age of 18 hastened to the Rhine to shed his blood there, and at the age of 50 could count 30 years of service, 9 campaigns, and 6 wounds. It is true that he left me nothing but honor and his sword, which you, sir, would shrink from seeing drawn. This is French journalistic style of 1832, not modest, certainly, but also not spiritless. Bertrand was one of the company of young men sympathetically alluded to by George Sand in Horace, who looked on Godfrey Cavaignac as their political leader and went by the name of Les Boussingates sailor hats. In Bertrand himself, republican bluntness was curiously combined with the artistic ultra-refinement of the romanticist. He never won fame. He put too much ardor into his first efforts, did not husband his strength. He overworked himself to support his mother and sister, and died in poverty in 1841 in a Paris hospital. David Dangers, the great romantic sculptor, who had faithfully watched by the bedside of the dying man, sent to Bertrand's home for a fine white sheet to wrap the body in, and was the solitary mourner who followed him to his grave. See David Dangers' touching letter on the subject of Bertrand's death in Charles Asselineau's Mélanges Thiers d'une petite bibliothèque romantique, 100. Author's footnote. He erected a monument to him, and Saint Beuve and Victor Pavy published his Gaspard de la Nuit. In 1842, 20 copies of this book were sold with difficulty, but in 1868 the Romanticist bibliophile, Charles Asselineau, brought out an edition deluxe. As an example of Bertrand's manner, I give in the original the sketch entitled Madame de Montbazin, with its motto, taken from Saint Simon's Memoirs. Madame de Montbazin était une forte belle creature qui mérite d'amour, c'est la priscilla. Lettre et l'autre siècle pour le chevalier de la rue qui ni elle aimait point. Memoirs de Saint Simon. La suivante rangia sur la table de lac, un vase de fleurs et les flambeaux de cire. Don't les reflets moirient de rouge et de jaune, les ridoux de soie bleu, au chevet du lit de la malade. Crois-tu Mariette quil viendra? Oh, dormes un peu, madame. Oui, je dormirai bientôt, pour revivre à lui tout l'éternité. On intendit quelqu'un monter à l'escalier? Ah, si c'était lui. Murmura la morante, en sourient, le papillon du tamo déjà sur les lèvres. Si était un petit page qui apportait de la part de la reine, à madame la duchesse, des confitures, des biscuits et des elixirs, sur un plateau d'argent. Ah, il n'y vient pas, dit-elle d'une voix défiante. Il n'y viendra pas. Mariette, donne-moi une de ces fleurs, que je la respire et la baise pour l'amour de lui. Alors Madame de Montbazin, ferment les yeux, demeura immobile. Elle était morte d'amour, rendant son âme dans le parfum d'une jacinthe. It often seems as if the place of those who disappear too early from the field of literature were, a little sooner or a little later, filled by others. But strictly speaking, no individual ever exactly fills another's place. The pen which fell from Louis Bertrand's hand was, undoubtedly, seized by Théophile Gautier, and Gautier's far more comprehensive talent caused Bertrand's to be forgotten. But no connoisseur can fail to see that in Bertrand's writing there is an exquisite, a marvelously touching quality, to the possession of which Gautier with his colder plastic gift never attained. Frequent mention has already been made of Petrus Borel, whose simple home was long the headquarters of Victor Hugo's young friends. Borel was both artist and author. He painted in de Viria's studio and wrote defiant poems under the nom de plume of the lycanthrope. He inspired the others with great respect. In appearance, he resembled a Spaniard or Arab of the 15th century. And when his comrades returned from the theater, after seeing Firmin an actor, accustomed to the roles in Delavine's and Scribe's plays play Hernani, they always lamented that the part of that ideal bandit could not be given to Petrus. He would have swooped down on the stage like a falcon, and how magnificent he would have looked in the red head covering and the leather jerkin with the green sleeves. Naturally he would, for he and such as he were the spiritual prototypes of Hernani. Rhapsodies, Borel's volume of poems, is a very youthful and immature work. It contains some really fine poetry mixed up with childish protests and imprecations. One thing it proves, that no prouder heart than its authors beat in the whole romantic group. His verses breathe the despair engendered by poverty, the loneliness, the ardent love of liberty and consuming thirst for justice, which fill the poet's heart. Read such a verse as the following, taken from the poem Desespoir. Comme une louve ayant fait chasse vaine. Grinkant les dents, et s'en va par le chemin. J'y vais, haggard, tout chard de ma peine. Seul avec moi, nul main dans ma main. Pas une voix qui me d'ici, a demain. And you have the reality of the emotional life which Dumas put on the stage in Antony. Even the getup of the book is significant. The frontispiece represents Borel himself sitting at his table with bared neck and arms, a Phrygian cap on his head, and in his hands a broad-bladed dagger, at which he is gazing, deep in thought. The The preface gives us a vivid impression of the tone prevailing in the Republican group of young romanticists in 1832. In it, Borel writes, I answer the question before it is asked, and say frankly, yes, I am a Republican. Ask the Duke of Orleans the King if he remembers the voice that pursued him on the 9th of August, when he was on his way to take the oath to the ex-chamber, shouting into his face, Libert et Republique, while the deceived populace was cheering loudly. But if I speak of republic, it is only because this word represents to me the greatest possible degree of independence which society and civilization permit. I am a Republican because I cannot be a Caribbean. I require an immense amount of liberty, and a man with a lot like mine, a man irritated by numberless evils, would deserve only approbation if he dreamed of absolute equality, if he demanded an agrarian law to those who say that there is something offensively vulgar about the book one. Reply that its author is certainly not the king's bedmaker. Is he not, nevertheless, on the level of an age in which the country is governed by stupid bankers and by a monarch whose motto is, Dieu soit lau et mes boutiques aussi? It is hardly necessary to mention that rapid promotion did not come the way of a young man who wrote in this style. Borel lived in great poverty. He knew what starvation meant, and more than once, without a roof to cover his head, was driven to seek shelter for the night in some half-finished building. His youthful hatred of wrong was also detrimental to him as an author. In his two-volume novel, Madame Pudafar, the character of the heroine, Madame Pompadour, is distorted by the writer's Republican indignation and aversion. The dissolute, art-loving muse of the Rococo period, who had a frivolous little leaning to free thought, who patronized the encyclopedists and took lessons in etching from Boucher, is transformed into a Megra, who throws herself at the head of a strange man, and when he refuses to have anything to do with her, punishes him for his indifference with imprisonment in an underground cell of the Bastille. Towards the end, the book improves. The storming of the Bastille, a subject which suited Borel's pen, is described in a vivid, fiery style which reeks of gunpowder. His third book, Champivert, Contes et Morocs, was published in 1833. It attracted no attention, and he made nothing by it an injustice of fate which is not altogether incomprehensible, seeing that several of the stories are written in their author's earliest, unpleasantly ferocious style. But in the best of them the indignation is mastered, is treated artistically, as lava is treated by the Kamacutter. All the tales deal with horrors, with deeds which, precisely because they are so frightful and unmentionable, are possible, since no criminal escapes punishment so easily as he who has committed a crime in which no one will believe. And they are such horrors as fiction seldom deals with, since one of the author's main aims generally is to produce a saleable book, if possible one suited for reading aloud in the family circle. The scene of the tale entitled Dina, La Belle Juive, is laid in Lyon in 1661. A manly, unprejudiced young nobleman has fallen in love with a beautiful young Jewess and goes off to his country home to try and obtain his father's consent to their marriage. The father curses his son, and in his fury actually tries to shoot him but misses him. One day, during Eimer's absence, Dina takes a walk by the banks of the Seine. Seized with a desire to go on the river, she hails a boat, steps on board, and lies down to dream under the awning as the boat glides down the stream. The boatman robs the beautiful Jewess of her rings and other ornaments, ties her arms, gags her, violates her, throws her into the river, and after the gag slips out of her mouth plunges his spear into her body every time it comes to the surface. Then he fishes up the corpse and takes it to the Hôtel de Ville to claim the 2 ducats which are given as a reward to anyone who recovers a body from the river. The magistrate asks, Le cadaver adil et ricanu. Oui, mesker, se yun jun fil, nami dina, enfant dun nam Israel Judas un lapidaire. Yun juiv. Oui, mesker, yun heretic, yun huguenot yun juiv. Yun juiv, tu vas pecher des juifs marsuful, et tu es la front après cela devenir demander récompense, ola valet, ola Martin, ola Lefebvre, mais moi si buter la porte, si politique. The scenes in the Jewish quarter and the scene in the boat are unsurpassable in their cruel realism. Borel's picture of Jewish life in the Middle Ages is equal to anything Heine has given us. In 1846, Théophile Gautier, with the assistance of that influential lady, Madame de Girardin, brought about a temporary improvement in Borel's circumstances. They procured him the post of colonial inspector in the interior of Algiers, near Mostaganem. Though it was a wretched little appointment, it exactly suited a man like Borel, with his werewolfish shrinking from contact with human beings, but he was soon dismissed from it, his strong sense of justice having led him, unfortunately for himself, to accuse a superior official of defrauding the government. He never saw France again. He He died in Africa of sunstroke, some say, according to others of starvation. Merimee, as we have already observed, took up Borel's special department of literature, and in his admirable short stories treated revolting subjects with a surer hand. But in Merimee's writing, the irony of the man of the world and the elegance of the courtier stifled the passion, which was Petrus Borel's strong point. In Merimee's works, we find some of the challenges which Borel flung in the face of society, paraphrased in language, which made them fit to lie on a drawing-room table. There was no inheritor of the fire which burned in the inmost sanctuary of Petrus Borel's soul. The last of these early paralyzed authors whom I shall name is Theophile Dondi, better known as Philothée Onetti. Onetti, born in 1811, made his literary debut in 1833 with a volume of poems entitled Feu et Flamme, which the public, reveling at the moment in a superabundance of excellent poetry, would have nothing to say to. The author, who was extremely poor, and was obliged, for the sake of supporting his mother, to attend to the duties of a small civil service appointment, lost courage, and never published another poem. Of his book, which he had brought out at his own expense, hardly a copy was sold. He withdrew like some wounded animal into its lair. Gaudier met him, a gray-haired man, 30 years later, and greeted him with the question, "When is the next collection of poems to appear?" Old Onetti answered with a sigh, "Oh, quand il n'y aura pas de bourgeois." It might have been supposed that his powers of production were exhausted. After his death, however, whole reams of beautiful lyric poetry were found among his papers. The market value of his first book is now 300 francs, which is certainly more than its author earned by all that he wrote. Theophile Dondi's early poems are quite as immature and as defiant as Borel's. In the preface to Feu et Flamme, he begs his greater comrades in arms to receive him into their fellowship. For, he writes, "Like you I despise with all my soul the social order, and the political order which is its excrement. Like you I scoff at the priority of age in literature, and in the academy. Like you I am left incredulous and cold by the magniloquence and the tinsel of the religions of the world. Like you I am kindled to pious emotion only by poetry, the twin sister of God." He is restless, excited, overstrained. Sometimes he is ill, sometimes haunted by the thought of suicide, and everything is expressed in verses chiseled by the hand of a master. One of the outbursts in the suicidal strain is very original. By upholding the doctrine of the Trinity, in which he does not believe, the poet makes of Christ's sacrificial death the model suicide. Va quella mort soit un refuge. A l'exemple du Rédempteur. Os à la fois etre le juge. La victime et l'exécuteur. Those of Onetti's poems which do not deal with his own personality are all devoted to the cause of free thought and the coming republic. But by far the greater number are profoundly personal, about 7/8 being love poems. A distinguished lady honored him, the nameless poor plebeian with her love, and the poems overflow with melancholy rapture and idolization of the beloved. But feeling and knowing himself to be ill, Onetti is certain that happiness is not for him, and involuntarily couples the thought of love with the thought of death. The poetic form which as a youth he sought and found was one which satisfied himself, because it was an exactly suitable vehicle for his feelings and thoughts. But he did not, like more fortunate poets, succeed in imparting transparency and attractiveness to this form. Therefore the reading public turned its back on him. He felt himself ever more and more forgotten by life, doomed to die with unused powers. Again and again in his posthumous poems, he calls himself a living corpse. Here, for example, is one of his sonnets. Un montagnard avait une excellente épée. Quil lacet si ruler dans un coin obscur. Un jour elle lui dit, que si repose est dur. Guerrier si tu voulais, malame est bien trempé. Dans tes rudes combats sur la côte escarpée. Elle vaudrait about de ton bras fermet sur. Les otters espadons qui brillant sous si mur. Pourquoi seul entretus estel inoccupé. G sways comme si glaive et g dis au destin. Pourquoi seul de mon type age unsort clandestine. Ignores tu quel est la trempe de mon âme. El pourrait jeter de gloria reflets. Si ta droit au solo facet jour sa lame. El est d'un noble assir, destin si tu voulais. But destiny, according to its custom and nature, was inexorable. Like the shipwrecked man clinging to his rock, waiting for a ship to appear on the horizon and come to his rescue, Onetti waited for years. But the ship of destiny sailed past and left him standing alone on his rock. When the lady who had loved him deserted him, he gave up all hope. His poetry, meanwhile, had been gradually assuming a more serious and philosophically cast. In one poem, reversing the Cartesian axiom, he declares, "I suffer, therefore I am." And many other beautiful poems are pessimistic in a degree which is uncommon in romantic lyric verse. Read, for instance, the following lines. Or questque livrai c'est le malheur. Il souffle et elheur vaincu assetint, vain apparence. Says pourvoyeurs constance, le désir et l'espérance. Sous leur flamme nous, font mûrir pour la douleur. Livrai c'est l'incertain, livrai c'est l'ignorance. C'est le tâtonnement dans l'ombre et dans l'erreur. C'est un concert de fate avec un fond de horreur. C'est le neutre, l'oubli, le Freud et l'indifference. Onetti tried criticism, but at an unpropitious moment. He began to praise Hugo as a dramatist just when, in the 40s, the great man's popularity was on the wane. Its freshness of feeling lends beauty to his passionately enthusiastic defense of Les Burgraves. In his animadversions on the attitude of Hugo's critics to Ponsard's Lucrece, Onetti was not unjust to Ponsard and showed a spirit of noble reverence. But the next time he wrote in defense of Hugo, the editorship of the Patrie was in other hands, and his article was returned to him. He took this rebuff to heart and gave up journalism, never again writing a newspaper article. He withdrew into his own inner world, feeling like Don Quixote after his return home, or Moliere's misanthrope when he wearily seeks solitude. Yet he writes in his last poem that, unbeliever in immortality though he may be, if ever his heroes should ride victoriously over his forgotten grave, his heart will beat again, in time with their horses' gallop. Et qui tendre l'oreille, ouïr a mon fier cœur. Bondir à l'unison, du fier gallop vainqueur. The heroes for whom he had the profoundest admiration were, amongst the men of action, Garibaldi; amongst the poets, Victor Hugo; and amongst prose authors, Michelet and Quinet, and, at a later period, Renan. Onetti's later life was sad. After losing his ladylove, he lost his mother. He was long ill, and in the end paralyzed. Only one pleasure was reserved for his old age, that of seeing himself warmly appreciated by Théophile Gautier in an article which now forms part of the latter's Histoire du Romantisme. He did not die till 1875, when he had been silent as a poet for 42 years. Whilst we are occupied in seeking out these victims of the literary battle and victory, we seem all the time to hear a funeral march played on muffled drums. And when we have seen how numerous they are, we involuntarily regard such a book as De Vigny's Stello, and such a drama as his Chatterton in a more favorable light. The idea of the suffering poet or artist was an ever-present one at that period, and yet many were allowed to perish who deserved a better fate. It would seem that at all times, in every age, there is a difficulty in finding out the deserving, suffering men of talent. The historian whose aim is, not to touch his readers, but to throw light upon his subject, gives these background figures a momentary prominence because the characteristics of the age are no less legibly and markedly displayed in their works than in those of its geniuses. The geniuses show us romanticism in its health and strength. Its pathology is to be studied in the works and lives of these unfortunates, who are so enthusiastically devoted to a foreign language that they neglect the cultivation of their own, or who blaze up in a sudden, ephemeral literary activity, or who make a desperate assault on fame only to be discouraged forever by their first repulse, or who are mortally wounded by the indifference of the public, or who convulsively strain their powers until they suddenly give way. These men are as legitimate offspring of the Romanticism of 1830 as any of the others. They are its genuine enfants perdis. Roman 35. Conclusion. Such was this school, such were its victors and its vanquished, such its artistic and its social enthusiasts. Thus it arose, thus, with all this wealth of genius and talent, it grew to be great. Thus it dissolved as a school to continue its life in the intellectual life of widely different individuals who, even when in appearance farthest from their starting point, nevertheless retain the essential qualities of the school. For we all keep long upon our shoulders the mark of the first banner we bore. The Romantic school was broken up and scattered. But before its extinction, Romanticism had revitalized style in almost every branch of literature, had brought hitherto undreamt of subjects within the range of art, had allowed itself to be fertilized by all the social and religious ideas of the day, had recreated lyric poetry. The drama, fiction, and criticism had insinuated itself as a fertilizing power into the science of history, as an inspiring power into politics. To have attempted to write a complete history of the school would have been, in my case, to have attempted an impossibility. Here, as elsewhere in this work, I have traced only the main currents. I have dwelt long and in detail on the principal personages, instead of introducing numerous secondary personages who, in spite of their real importance and interest, would have stood in the way of the condensation, which has been my aim. And I have even followed the careers of one or two of these principal personages beyond the limit of the period, seeing that it was not until after 1848 that they displayed their originality in its entirety. Many remarkable personalities I have merely sketched, such as Alexander Dumas, who may well be called the Ariosto of French Romanticism, and de Vigny, who has described himself in the saying, "Honor is the poetry of duty." Others I have only been able to name, such as Jules Janin, the prince of feuilletonists, whose novel, Hélène Morte et la Femme Guillotine, is such a remarkable forerunner of the naturalism of a later period, and Nodier's successor, Gerard de Nerval, the Euphorion of Romanticism, whose female characters are ethereally delicate, whose preternatural fantasies have an oriental marvelousness, and whose sonnets, written when he was insane, are amongst the cleverest and most beautiful which the period has produced. Many men of talent of the second and third rank I have been obliged to leave altogether unnoticed, such as Antony Deschamps, who occupies much the same place in literature as Leopold Robert does in art, and Victor Hugo's worshipper, Auguste Vacquerie, who is interesting because of his blind belief in romanticism and his aplomb, and whose drama Tragibaldas is one of the boldest exploits of French romantic volatility. I have only been able, and have only desired, as a rule, to present the great typical figures in relief. The great woman of the period, George Sand, must stand alone, as a representative of its women, interesting though it would have been to describe several of the others, clever Madame de Girardin, melancholy Madame Despordes Valmore, or the two emancipated authoresses, the Comtesse d'Agoult and Madame Allert. Sainte-Beuve is the solitary representative of criticism. Both Flairite Chasles and Jules Janin I have been obliged to ignore, and Balzac alone represents realism in fiction, no mention being made of less gifted and profound observers of life, like Alphonse Karr or Charles de Bernard. The authors of the generation of 1830 naturally divide themselves into two groups, a small group which wrote for the whole world, and a larger, which wrote for France alone. It is only the former which I have endeavored to place distinctly before my readers. We have seen how the character of the two Restoration monarchies, the legitimist and the popular, formed the historic background from which Romanticism projected itself, and without which it cannot be understood. And we have also observed that the movement had numerous foreign forerunners and a not inconsiderable period of preparation in France itself. The Restoration starts Romanticism, the Justemilieu government goads it on, the study of Scott and Byron, Goethe and Hoffmann, enriches it. At the hands of André Chenier, it receives its lyrical consecration. The controversies in the globe develop its critical powers. The writings of Charles Nodier, which are romantic in the general, European sense of the word, prepare the way for the great French romanticists. Then Victor Hugo assumes the leadership of the movement, proves himself capable of the task he has undertaken, and hastens from victory to victory. Presently he and de Vigny are named in the same breath with Lamartine as lyric poets. Then Hugo outshines all the rest. Both Sainte-Beuve and Théophile Gautier possess a lyrical vein, but as a lyric poet, Alfred de Musset supplants all the other younger men in the favor of the reading public, in time supplants even Hugo himself, and is long the idol of youth. Romanticism had at first a historical tendency. De Vigny, Victor Hugo, Balzac, Merimée endeavored to give France the historical novel of which England was so proud. Vitet, Merimée, Alexander Dumas, de Vigny, Hugo tried to create a historical drama which should take the place of tragedy. But the historical novel soon made way for the modern novel in its various forms, as written by George Sand, Bayle, and Balzac. And the historical drama also soon lost favor, for it was, generally speaking, either uninterestingly dry, as in the case of Vitet's and Merimée's plays, or exaggeratedly lyrical, as in Hugo's. The dramatic authors had, as a rule, most success on the stage after the first passion of their youth had raged itself out. There came a time in the 40s when there existed, not only an école de bon sens outside of the Romantic school, but a phase of bon sens in the lives of the authors within the Romantic circle. It was during this period that Alfred de Musset wrote his short plays and George Sand her peaceful novels and peasant stories. Whilst Hugo was steadily increasing in power as a lyric poet, Gautier was leading Romanticism in the direction of plastic art. Balzac developed it in the direction of physiology, Bayle in the direction of national or comparative psychology, Merimee in the historical direction, Sainte-Beuve in that of naturalistic criticism. In every one of these domains, the generation of 1830 has produced imperishable works. The French Romantic school may therefore, without exaggeration, be called the greatest literary school of the 19th century. The end.